There is a question that floats around the Warhammer 40,000 community, like smoke from a burning battlefield. You hear it in forums, in comment sections, in game stores while people stare at miniatures under warm light, and it has a way of grabbing hold of you once you start really turning it over, because the more layers you peel back, the stranger and more interesting it becomes. The question goes something like this. If orcs love nothing more than a great fight, if their entire existence is built around seeking out the biggest and the meanest and the most dangerous thing they can find, if their gods demand blood and their biology demands war, and their culture has never once in the entire history of the species produced a single individual who looked out at the galaxy and thought, maybe today is a good day to not be fighting something, then why do they seem to simply not engage the Adeptus Custodes? Why do the green-skinned engines of destruction that have overwhelmed Space Marine legions, challenged Primarchs in direct combat, turned entire star systems into debris that still glitters with the fragments of shattered worlds, and whose raw numbers are so vast that the Imperium has never once managed a complete extermination of any orc-held world, seem to treat the Golden Warriors of the Emperor like a category of threat that their instincts cannot quite lock onto? It is a strange question when you say it plainly. Orcs fight everything. They fight each other constantly the moment there is not a more interesting opponent available. They fight humans with glee, Eldar with enthusiasm, Tyranids with what can only be described as genuine joy, because Tyranids are exactly the kind of relentless and never-ending opponent that an orc's soul was built to meet. They have fought Necrons, those ancient and terrible beings who existed before almost everything else in the galaxy, without any notable hesitation. On more than one occasion in the records, they have charged into threats that experienced Imperial commanders classified as impossible without slowing down even slightly. And yet, the Custodians produce this strange hesitation, this unusual gap in the orc combat response to the universe. The answer to why, when you find it and when you truly understand it, is one of the most remarkable pieces of emergent lore in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. It is not a simple answer. It reaches down into the deepest roots of what orcs are at a biological and psychic level. It reaches into what Custodians are and what the Emperor built into them. It passes through a battle in the Great Crusade that shook even the Primarchs and left a mark on the Emperor's own armor. And it ends somewhere almost philosophical, in the territory where biology and cosmology and ancient design decisions meet and produce consequences that nobody planned. So let us settle into this together. Let us move at the pace the subject deserves, because rushing through it would do a disservice to what is genuinely one of the most layered and carefully constructed pieces of lore in the setting. This is the story of two of the most extraordinary types of beings in the known galaxy, and why one of them has no framework, at the deepest biological level, for correctly processing what the other one is. Part 1. The Orc at the Foundation, what they actually are. Before you can understand why orcs don't fight Custodians, you need to understand what an orc actually is, not at the surface level. Not the green skin and the loud guns and the exuberant love of explosions and the cheerful brutality. You need to go past all of that, past the culture and the mythology and the ramshackle aesthetics, all the way down to the engineering. Because orcs are not a naturally evolved species. They are not the product of slow biological pressures selecting for survival traits across millions of generations. They are a designed thing. A deliberately constructed weapon system built by minds operating at a level of genetic understanding that the 41st millennium cannot match and may never approach again. The orcs were made by the Old Ones, or something functionally equivalent to the Old Ones, depending on which strand of the very old and very layered lore you follow most closely. These beings are named the Brain Boys in Orc cultural memory, and the scholarly consensus among the Ordo Xenos is that they are identical with or closely related to the same ancient race that also created the Aeldari and the Jokero during the incomprehensibly distant past of the War in Heaven. The Old Ones are a name given by other species to beings who were, as far as the evidence allows reconstruction, masters of genetic engineering at a scale and sophistication that makes everything humanity has achieved in 10,000 years of the Imperium look like children drawing in the dirt. The War in Heaven itself is a conflict whose name captures something about its scale that a straightforward description cannot. The Necron tier, who would eventually transform themselves into the Necrons, allied with godlike entities called the C'tan, the star gods, who consumed solar bodies and treated astronomical objects as playthings. These forces were engaged in a war against the Old Ones that threatened to end all meaningful life in the galaxy, not as a side effect of the conflict, but as its explicit goal. The C'tan consumed life, the way fires consume oxygen. They were hunger given cosmic form. The Old Ones, who were beings of deep psychic power and extraordinary biological knowledge, needed soldiers to fight this war. Not diplomats, not builders, not thinking allies who would require negotiation and support, and who would fight for their own reasons. They needed weapons, living weapons that could be seeded across worlds without supply chains, that would reproduce and sustain themselves without external input, that would fight indefinitely, without needing to be told why, because the reason was inscribed into their very cells. The reason was the design. The design was the reason. They engineered the Orks. The Krork, they were called in that older time, and they were somewhat larger and more capable in certain respects than the modern Orks, having not yet experienced the long degradation of purpose that comes from millions of years without direction. But the fundamental design was the same. A species built around warfare as biological imperative rather than cultural choice. A species that reproduced through spores, meaning they could colonize and terraform environments simply by existing in them and dying in them. A species whose bodies were so engineered for combat and survival that the concept of a mortal wound had to be stretched far beyond what it means for most organic life. A species whose psychology was calibrated by the designers to produce the exact behaviors needed in a directed weapon at every individual scale and at the collective scale, without any of the hesitation or self-preservation instinct that would slow them down when the fighting needed to happen. The Old Ones built the Orks to be an unstoppable tide. They succeeded beyond any reasonable measure of success. The war in heaven eventually ended, though how is unclear. The Old Ones disappeared, whether through death or departure or transformation into something the current age has no word for. The Necrons entered their long sleep. The C'tan were shattered, and the Orks remained. Without the beings who had made them and directed them, without the conflict that had been their purpose, without anything to do but what they had been made to do, which was fight, they spread, world to world, system to system, across the entire galaxy, and possibly beyond it, seeding every environment they touched with the spores that ensured their return, growing back wherever they died, because the design had no off switch and no mechanism for scarcity. The Old Ones made something that works too well. The weapon outlasted the war, then outlasted the makers, then kept running because there was nothing in the architecture that commanded it to stop. Now we are in the 41st millennium, perhaps 100 million years or more after the war in heaven, and the Orks are still there, still spreading, still fighting. Still exactly what they were designed to be, with only the accumulated noise of aeons of cultural drift to distinguish modern Orks from the Krork that first engaged the Necron tier's forces. The design holds. The engineering endures. And understanding that engineering is the key to everything else we are going to discuss. The Ork body is, from the perspective of military biology, something approaching a masterwork. The skeleton is reinforced far beyond what any comparable mass of tissue requires for locomotion. The muscles produce force that rivals hydraulics and maintains that force through combat durations that would exhaust any normal biological system. The skin, made distinctively green by symbiotic algae that live in the cells and perform functions that extend well beyond coloration, absorbs physical punishment that would destroy most armor. The immune system is not merely robust, but aggressively regenerative, capable of fighting off infections that would kill organisms with far better environmental protection, capable of repairing tissue damage at rates that sit at the edge of what biology is supposed to be able to do. An Ork can lose a limb. Given time and a pain boy willing to work, that limb can be reattached. An Ork can sustain wounds that would be instantly lethal to any human and survive them, lie down briefly, allow the biological machinery to work, and then stand up somewhat larger and considerably angrier than before. They also continue to grow throughout their lives, which is a design feature rather than a quirk. An Ork that fights and wins grows bigger. A bigger Ork is stronger and tougher, A stronger and tougher orc wins more fights, and therefore grows more. The life cycle is a closed loop that rewards combat success with the physical currency of that success, producing ever larger and ever more capable warriors as the most successful individuals. The war boss at the top of the hierarchy sits there not just because he has defeated challengers, but because defeating challengers has literally made him a larger and more dangerous organism. The authority and the physical reality reinforce each other in a system of elegant, brutal efficiency. Reproduce through spores, spread without infrastructure, grow through victory, die and seed the ground for renewal. This is the orc life cycle, and it means that eliminating an orc presence from a world requires not just defeating the army, but systematically sterilizing every cubic meter of soil and stone that orcs have touched. The orc infestation of any world is not an occupying force that can be expelled. It is a biological state of the world itself. This is why imperial scholars discuss orc infestations in the language of disease and ecological contamination rather than military occupation. All of this is well established and broadly known to anyone who has studied the orcs in more than casual detail. But here is the piece that even many fans of the lore do not fully absorb. The piece that transforms the orcs from merely a very tough alien species into something with a genuine claim to being the most powerful collective entity in the known galaxy. The orcs are psychic, every single one of them. From the smallest Gretchen to the greatest warlord, they all generate and contribute to a psychic field, a gestalt web of warp-adjacent energy produced by the collective belief and vitality and aggression of the entire species simultaneously. This field does not manifest as individual psyker powers in most cases. A standard orc boy does not hurl lightning or read minds. The field is more subtle than that, and considerably more pervasive. It is the operating frequency on which orc society actually runs. The medium through which orc instincts communicate with each other and with the collective. The mechanism by which orc technology functions despite being physically inadequate. The mechanism by which orc social hierarchies are enforced without courts or law enforcement or any of the external infrastructure that other species use to maintain social order. And the source of the great communal battle spirit that fuels their invasions and sustains them through adversity that would break any other species. The gestalt field grows stronger as more orcs gather in proximity. It intensifies as orcs fight. At its peak, during the largest campaigns, the field reaches a strength that the Imperium's instruments detect at stellar distances. It manifests as background psychic pressure, a tide of green-tinged energy that sits adjacent to the warp but draws from a different mechanism than standard psyker power. It is different in character from the dangerous and chaotic warp emissions of psykers, but is, in its own way, equally powerful and considerably more stable. This field does things that matter enormously to our story. Part 2. The Hierarchy Field, the Operating System of Orc Society. The Gestalt field's role in orc social organization is one of those details that sounds almost comical when described briefly, but becomes genuinely fascinating when you sit with it long enough to understand its full implications. It is, in the most direct sense, the mechanism that makes orcs what they are as a collective military force, rather than just a very numerous collection of violent individuals. Orcs instinctively obey those larger than themselves. This is stated plainly in virtually every source that discusses orc sociology, but that simple statement conceals a remarkable biological mechanism. The instinctive recognition of dominance hierarchy is not a learned behavior. It is not a cultural norm that orcs grow up internalizing through social pressure or correction. It is encoded at the genetic level by the beings who made them. It is produced by the Gestalt field and received by individual orcs as something indistinguishable from direct physical sensation. Seeing a larger orc and feeling the appropriate combination of aggressive suppression, submission, and proximity seeking that constitutes orc deference is not a thought process. It is a direct physical experience. The field communicates it as immediately and as certainly as vision communicates color. This mechanism exists because the old ones needed a self-organizing military hierarchy that required no external administration to function. Without a command structure, the orcs would fight each other without cessation and achieve nothing collectively. With a genetically installed hierarchy evaluator, the largest and most successful fighters naturally rise to command positions through continuous physical competition, and the field validates those positions in a way that every other orc can receive and act on. The command structure self-assembles constantly through the mechanism of combat. The field enforces it without need of law or tradition, or any external institution. The field, as a hierarchy enforcement mechanism, has to reach past what an individual orc can directly see. In a large gathering of thousands or millions, the war boss is not visible to every orc in the mob, but the field carries his presence. His authority radiates through the field as a kind of psychic pressure that every orc within range can feel, even without visual confirmation of his size and power. The field says there is something very dominant in that direction. Orient toward it. Let it direct your violence. Follow or be beaten into following, which is in practice the same outcome, since orcs do not hold grudges about beatings in the way humans might. This evaluation mechanism also governs orc interaction with non-orcs. The field does not switch off when the being in question is not a greenskin. It evaluates everything. Every being that enters an orc's awareness gets assessed by the same machinery. How large is this? How does this smell, in the physiological sense of the word, that includes every sensory input the orc receives? What does the field say about this thing's relative position on the scale of power? Based on that assessment, the orc's immediate behavioral disposition is set before any conscious decision-making occurs. The evaluation runs faster than thought. By the time an orc consciously notices a potential opponent, the field has already categorized it, and the initial response is already forming. For most things in orc encounters, this evaluation is fast and produces a clear, actionable output. A human guardsman, small, fragile, the field says minor threat, suitable target for aggression, not a status opponent, not worth more than casual violence. A space marine, significantly more powerful, clearly transhuman, the field says serious threat and interesting opponent, someone worth engaging fully. An orc knob, dominance signals in excess of the evaluating orc's own. The field says authority, suppress challenge for now, or demonstrate sufficient strength to justify the challenge. An orc war boss, overwhelming dominance in every dimension. The field says this is the boss, orient toward this, allow this being to direct your violence. All of these evaluations complete quickly. All of them produce clear outputs. All of them fit within the parameters the field was designed to handle. The categories are all legible, but the field was designed for a specific context. It was designed by the Old Ones to manage orc behavior in a galaxy that contained the orcs, their enemies, and implicitly the Old Ones themselves who were directing the operation. The Old Ones were not enemies. They were not rivals in the hierarchy. They were the makers. They were above and outside the hierarchy system entirely, because the hierarchy was something they designed, and the thing that designed the hierarchy cannot be placed within it. The field, in the most fundamental layer of its architecture, has a gesture toward this category, a recognition of authority that exists at a level beyond the hierarchy. A handler for the input case of, this being is not a competitor, not a subordinate, not a boss in the normal sense, but something that sits outside all of those categories. The thing that made the fighting possible in the first place. The thing for which the fighting exists. What the field does with beings that fall into this category is the thing that matters for our story. And the answer is, the field produces a kind of respectful freeze. Not fear, because orcs are not constructed for fear in the retreat and self-preservation sense. Not aggression, because the field does not classify this input as a target. Something closer to the cognitive halt that any sophisticated processing system produces when it encounters input outside its designed operational parameters. The loop does not complete. The output is indeterminate, and an orc without a clear output from the field is an orc standing still, which in orc terms is the closest thing to the impossible. The Old Ones are gone. The field has not encountered anything that fully activates this recognition response since the War in Heaven, because nothing that exists in the modern galaxy is quite what the Old Ones were, but there are things that partially activate it. Things that produce fragments of the response, because they share qualities with what the Old Ones were in terms of raw psychic presence and depth of power. Things that fall outside the hierarchy's categories, not by being at the extreme high end of the hierarchy, but by being adjacent to the category that was above and outside the hierarchy entirely. The Emperor of Mankind is one such thing, and the Custodians, who carry his direct imprint encoded into their very biology, produce a derivative of this effect that is real enough to matter on every battlefield where they walk. Part 3. The Adeptus Custodes, a different kind of creation. There is a misconception about Custodians that even experienced Warhammer 40,000 fans sometimes carry, which is that they are essentially very superior Space Marines. Better armor, better statistics, more prestigious role, same fundamental concept of enhanced human soldiers. This is understandable because the surface aesthetics have some similarities. Power armor, bolter weapons, warriors in the Emperor's service. But the fundamental nature of what they are and how they were made is so different from the Space Marine process that comparing them is like comparing a unique handcrafted instrument built specifically for a master musician to a master musician, standardized military rifle. Both are weapons. That is approximately where the similarity ends. Space Marines are the result of a sophisticated and carefully developed but fundamentally scalable biological engineering process. The gene seed system, the 19 implants documented by the Adeptus Mechanicus that reshape human biology over years of training and development, the black carapace that interfaces directly with the warrior's nervous system and extends it into the power armor, all of this represents engineering of the highest order humanity has achieved. The process can be replicated. It can be administered by trained apothecaries without the direct involvement of its original designer. It produces reliable and consistent results within a predictable range of variation. It scales, imperfectly and with variability between different gene seed strains, but it scales. This is why approximately 1,000 Space Marine chapters exist, each nominally 1,000 warriors strong, spread across the galaxy in numbers, that allow them to respond to threats across the Imperium's vast extent. Custodians are not made by any process that scales. The exact method of Custodian creation is one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Imperium. It is held by the Custodians themselves, by the most trusted bioalchemists of Terra, and by whatever fragments of the Emperor's own knowledge can be accessed through the processes surrounding the Golden Throne on which he has sat for 10,000 years. What is known, from the oldest and most carefully preserved accounts, is that each Custodian undergoes a transformation that is unique to that individual. Not unique in the sense of small variations within a common template. Unique in the sense that the transformation is tailored specifically to the individual being transformed, drawing on the Emperor's full depth of genetic knowledge to reshape the subject at a level far deeper than any gene seed process reaches. The old accounts, read with appropriate source-critical awareness, but consistent enough across multiple independent references to carry evidential weight, say that the Emperor worked on each Custodian personally, that the transformation engaged not merely the physical substrate, but something deeper, something that the texts describe using the word soul in a way that, in the context of Warhammer 40,000 lore, is not entirely metaphorical, but may describe something with genuine material correlates in the warp. The result is not a stronger human in the way that a Space Marine is a stronger human. It is something qualitatively different, something that has been reshaped at a level that current biological understanding cannot fully account for. What this produces, physically, is extraordinary. In full armor, a Custodian stands close to 9 feet tall. They carry mass that rivals military vehicles. Their strength is sufficient to wield weapons that would require several unenhanced humans working together to even lift, and they wield those weapons in one hand. Their neural processing speed, the velocity at which they receive and interpret sensory information and translate it into action, exceeds that of a Space Marine by a margin that observers describe as the difference between being fast and being something else entirely. In combat, this manifests as a kind of prescience. Custodians read opponents before the opponents have finished forming their attack, respond to movements that have not yet been completed, and position themselves against threats that have not yet fully materialized. Their cognitive dimensions are equally extraordinary. In many cases, they have been alive for hundreds of years, sometimes over 1,000. They are scholars of genuine depth, historians, philosophers, diplomats, tacticians at a level that can engage with Primarch-grade strategic thinking. The Emperor did not make simple soldiers. He made beings who could function as his hands and eyes in any environment, not only on the battlefield. A Custodian can navigate the political labyrinth of the High Lords of Terra as effectively as they can navigate a war zone. They can identify an assassination attempt hidden in a piece of legislation as efficiently as they can identify an ambush in a narrow corridor. They can read a room, read a face, read a soul, and they have been reading all three for longer than most of the people in any given room have been alive. The armor they wear, called Custodian armor and forged from auramite rather than the ceramite used in Space Marine plate, provides protection that measurably exceeds ceramite at comparable mass. Each suit is a unique creation, worked with the same individual attention that went into the Custodian wearing it, adorned with precious stones and heraldic symbols, and the accumulated marks of service, in ways that are simultaneously aesthetic and functional records of individual history. The Guardian Spear, the iconic weapon of the Custodian Guard, is a composite weapon combining a powered blade and an integrated bolter into a single instrument that no ordinary human being could practically wield. The Custodian carries it in one hand. The other hand is free for the Misericordia at their hip. The total number the Emperor's creation process has ever produced across all the millennia, from the Unification Wars to the present day, is 10,000. This number was reached at the height of the Great Crusade and has never been exceeded. 10,000 warriors, each a unique creation, each representing an investment of care and biological craft that cannot be replicated quickly. When a Custodian dies, the loss is genuinely irreplaceable, in a way that Space Marine casualties, however grievous, are not. The records say that the Emperor had the names of the 3 Custodians who fell at the Battle of Gyros-Thravian engraved into his personal power armor, not in a book, not on a wall, on himself, as a permanent memorial carried into every subsequent engagement. 10,000, against a galaxy where Ork populations are measured in the billions, where a single major engagement can involve millions of greenskins, where the Orks are the most numerous species in the known universe by any measure. 10,000 warriors who are each, individually, a force multiplier of extraordinary magnitude, but who can never be everywhere, and who can never form the mass that conventional military doctrine requires to hold contested ground. They are not designed to be everywhere. They are designed to be where the Emperor is and where his survival requires them. And what this means, what the Emperor built into them, is that they must be capable of defeating anything that might threaten him, regardless of its nature. Not most things, anything, because the Emperor cannot be allowed to fall, and so the Emperor's Guard cannot have categories of threat it cannot handle. The Orks are the most numerous and persistent category of threat in the galaxy. The Custodians were designed, among everything else they are, to handle the Orks. Not numerically, 10,000 cannot outfield billions, but qualitatively, in the way that a key handles a lock, through the specific character of what they are and what they were made from. Part 4. The Creation Gap Understanding What Separates These Warriors. To fully understand the capability differential that exists between Custodians and other warriors, it is worth building out the specific comparative analysis carefully, because the numbers involved are remarkable enough to merit their own treatment, and the context matters for understanding why even these extraordinary differences are not the primary mechanism we are discussing. An Imperial Guardsman is a trained human soldier. They are brave in the aggregate and often individually. They have genuine fighting capability within their biological limits. They die by the thousands in every major engagement, because human biology is not suited to the wars of the 41st millennium, when the threats involved include bolter rounds, energy weapons, alien talons, and the full catalog of ways to end organic life that 10,000 years of total war has developed and refined. Individually, a guardsman is effective within a narrow range of situations. In properly organized formations with adequate fire support and command coordination, they constitute a genuine military force. Their strength lies in numbers, organization, and their capacity for production at scale. There are hundreds of billions of them. Their individual fragility is a cost the Imperium has always been willing to pay. A Space Marine exceeds the Guardsman so dramatically that the same units of comparison do not quite apply. Enhanced biology from 19 gene seed implants, power armor that makes them effectively immune to most small arms fire and extends their strength well beyond biological limits, bolt weapons that punch significantly above their apparent size, decades of training in environments designed to produce the maximum possible combat effectiveness. All of this combines to produce a warrior who can reasonably accomplish tasks that would require significant guard force packages to attempt. The precise ratios vary enormously with context, terrain, and the nature of the task, but the fundamental superiority is real and consistent. A Space Marine is what the Imperium sends when a Guardsman company is not sufficient. A Space Marine chapter is what you send when there needs to be a guarantee. A Custodian is the same quality of gap, applied again above the Space Marine. In close combat, which is where Orks operate most effectively, and where the comparison is most directly relevant, the gap between a standard Custodian and a standard Space Marine is so large that experienced observers struggle to describe it without resorting to language that sounds like exaggeration. One of the more analytical descriptions available, from the events recorded in the Master of Mankind, describes how a scholar observing Custodians in combat notices something specific. The Custodians are not ending engagements as quickly as they could. They are spending the first few exchanges studying their opponents, learning the fighting style, identifying patterns, before delivering the killing blow with geometric efficiency. The account notes that no warrior lasted more than 3 blows against a Custodian's actual offensive effort. They were learning from every fight, even when they could have ended it immediately. The warriors who can approach a Custodian in individual combat are not ordinary Space Marines, but the extraordinary exceptions within an already extraordinary population. Chapter Masters, first captains of the most elite companies. Individuals with centuries of continuous combat experience whose names appear in chapters of the Codex Astartes because their deeds are too significant to omit. Even these warriors, meeting a standard Custodian, are fighting uphill. The gap at the top of the Space Marine hierarchy meets the bottom of the Custodian range, and the meeting is not comfortable for the Space Marine. Now introduce an Ork war boss. A war boss who has been fighting and winning for decades, reaches up to 10 feet in height, and a mass that rivals armored military vehicles. They carry weapons capable of shearing through tank armor. Their skin is several centimeters thick, and their pain tolerance is so extreme that injuries causing incapacitating shock in any other organism are experienced as minor inconvenience. The Ork life cycle has shaped them into something that, evaluated purely as a close combat threat, sits among the most dangerous organisms the galaxy produces. A war boss going through a Space Marine squad that lacks specific countermeasures produces outcomes that experienced Imperial commanders find alarming even in retrospect. And a Custodian was built to handle this. Built specifically to handle this, among everything else. Built to handle several of these simultaneously. Built to handle hundreds of ordinary Orks. Built, as the historical record makes clear, to handle 100,000 of them in a single engagement and emerge with 3 losses. The mathematics of combat between Orks and Custodians, when laid out honestly, is so one-sided that calling it a competitive engagement seems almost unfair. But, and this is the critical point, this is not why Orks don't fight Custodians. The mathematics, presented to an Ork who understood them, would not discourage them. An Ork who truly comprehended how much harder Custodians were to kill than Space Marines would be consumed by desire to fight them. The highest possible stakes, the greatest possible challenge, the most glory available. The mathematics would make Custodians the most desirable opponents in the galaxy for any Ork with the courage to try. The mechanism that produces the non-engagement is not the math, it is the field. It is the hierarchy evaluation. It is the deep Ork instinct reaching toward the Custodian and returning no data that it can parse into a clear behavioral output. And that is the story we are actually here to tell. Part 5. The Battle of Gyros-Thravian, What History Tells Us. The Battle of Gyros-Thravian is the historical event that demonstrates everything we have discussed in the most concentrated and undeniable form. It is also, considered analytically, one of the most remarkable military engagements in the entire history of the Imperium. The circumstances are specific enough to be useful analytically, and the outcome is dramatic enough to be impossible to wave away. This battle took place late in the Great Crusade, during the last century of the 30th millennium. The Orc warlord Garkul Blackfang had assembled a force that, by the standards of Orc military history, was genuinely exceptional. The accounts describe Blackfang himself as one of the most powerful war bosses ever encountered to that point in the Crusade, a statement carrying significant weight, given that Imperial military historians of this period had extensive experience with Orc forces across hundreds of star systems. Blackfang was not simply massive, though he was certainly that. The accounts suggest a degree of battlefield awareness and instinctive tactical sense that distinguished him from the typical warlord who wins through size and aggression alone. His horde was the direct product of this capability. Orcs gather to a successful war boss the way water finds low ground. The more victories Blackfang accumulated, the more orcs his reputation drew in, the larger his force became, the more the gestalt field around his gathering intensified. By the time the Imperium assembled a response, Blackfang commanded a force so large that the Imperial strategists concluded the response needed to be something unprecedented. 3 full Space Marine legions. The Luna Wolves under Horus, the Imperial Fists under Rogaldorn, the Death Guard under Mortarion, 3 of the Primarchs, 3 demigods of war whose individual combat capability and strategic genius had conquered hundreds of worlds between them during the Great Crusade, each leading their entire legion. The combined force numbered tens of thousands of Space Marines supported by Imperial Army soldiers many times that number, the full weight of what a campaign in the outer reaches of the Crusade could marshal. This force came within reach of defeat. The accounts are consistent on this point, and consistency across multiple independent sources is the closest thing to historical certainty that the fragmented records of this period permit. Not slowly winning and taking longer than expected, not struggling but managing, coming within reach of defeat in the operational sense, where the structure of the campaign was beginning to fail and the momentum had shifted to the other side. 3 Primarchs could not break the horde. Horus, who was in this period the most capable military mind among all the Emperor's sons, whose tactical genius the Emperor himself was said to find remarkable. Rogaldorn, whose grasp of fortification and defensive warfare had made the Imperial Fists the foundation of Imperial Fortress doctrine. Mortarion, whose personal combat ability was so extreme that being his enemy in direct engagement was a death sentence. 3 of these beings, leading tens of thousands of the finest human warriors ever produced, could not break the Orc horde's cohesion, and were watching the campaign begin to tip the wrong way. The reason is legible through the lens of what we now know about Orc combat psychology. The 3 legions and their Primarchs were producing dead Orcs, many dead Orcs. The Death Guard accounts from this engagement note over 17,000 Orc casualties in one phase of the fighting, at a cost of more than 1,500 Space Marines. The Orcs kept coming, the horde kept coming. The Gestalt field was running at peak intensity, fed by the combat, fed by the excitement of fighting 3 Primarchs, fed by the collective recognition that this was the greatest fight available in the sector. The deaths were being absorbed. The field was sustaining the momentum. The feedback loop was running exactly as designed. Then the Emperor arrived. From his orbital flagship, the Bucephalus, he descended with 1,000 Custodians. The entire deployable strength of the Legio Custodes at that moment, a number reached only once in the entire history of the 10,000, gathered in a single operational force. The Emperor at their head, personally leading his guard into combat in a way he did only very rarely during the Crusade, because the risk to his person in direct engagement was real, and the consequences of his death were incalculable. He killed Blackfang personally. The accounts describe the Emperor confronting the warlord atop his Gargant and killing him there, atop a war machine that symbolized the scale of Orc ambition. While this happened, the Custodians engaged the warlord's prime warriors, the hand-selected elite of Blackfang's force, the beings that an Orc warlord of this magnitude would have built around himself as his personal fighting strength. Within moments, 100,000 Orcs were dead. 3 Custodians had fallen. These are the numbers the sources give. They have been debated. Any large historical battle produces figures that are partially mythologized. The account itself acknowledges the legendary quality of the claim. But even applying significant discount, the event's fundamental character does not change. The Custodians and the Emperor broke a force that 3 Primarchs and their legions could not break. And they broke it, not by grinding through superior firepower, but by something that resolved in moments rather than in months. The 3 custodians who died had their names carved into the Emperor's personal armor, not in a book, not on a memorial wall somewhere in the palace, on his own body, carried by him into every subsequent engagement as a permanent record. Read what this detail actually communicates. In an engagement where the other side lost 100,000 or something in that order, the loss was 3, and those 3 were irreplaceable enough, singular enough, that the most powerful human being in history inscribed their individual names on himself permanently. The analytical point is not the casualty ratio, remarkable as it is. The analytical point is why the 3 legions could not achieve what the Custodians achieved in moments. The legions had been killing orcs, many orcs. The field had been processing those deaths as combat attrition and sustaining the horde's momentum, because those deaths were happening within a framework the field could use. Space Marines are comprehensible targets. They register on the hierarchy evaluation. They are big, dangerous, exciting opponents. The deaths of orcs fighting Space Marines and Primarchs fed back into the collective as, this is the fight we are here for. The momentum built. The field was running hot and sustaining itself on the very combat it was enabling. Then the Custodians arrived, and something happened to the field. Not just the killing of orcs, but the disruption of the field's ability to sustain the feedback loop that kept the horde fighting as a coherent collective force. 100,000 orcs died, and the horde broke, not because it ran out of orcs, but because the field lost the coherence that kept it a horde rather than a mob. The field broke because the Custodians and the Emperor were inputs the field had no category for, because the hierarchy evaluation reached toward them and returned nothing it could use, because the creator recognition system that the old ones installed in the orc genome, dormant for millions of years, partially fired in the presence of the Emperor's imprint, carried in 1,000 golden warriors, and the firing of that ancient code disrupted the field's ability to maintain the collective state it needed. Part 6. The field failure in detail. What happens when orc instinct encounters a null input? Let us go very slowly through the mechanism now, because this is where the explanation lives in its most precise form, and it is worth getting right. The Gestalt field is an evaluative system. It processes inputs. It produces outputs that shape orc behavior. For most inputs, the processing is fast, clean, and produces actionable outputs. Fight this, defer to this, dominate this, ignore this. For inputs outside the operational parameters, the processing fails to complete, and the output is indeterminate. Orc biology, at the cellular level, contains the evaluation algorithm that the old ones installed. Part of that algorithm handles the creator category input, the thing that is above the hierarchy, the authority beyond the system, the being for which the system exists, rather than the being that participates in it. This part of the algorithm fires when the input sufficiently resembles what the old ones were. Not when it exactly matches, because the old ones are gone, and nothing in the current galaxy exactly matches them. But when the input carries enough of what the old ones were, enough of the psychic depth, enough of the biological authority, enough of the resonance of things that shaped the orc genome at the foundational level, to partially activate the code. The Emperor partially activates this code, not fully, because the Emperor is not an old one. He is human, or was before he became whatever he is now, and his nature, however extraordinary, is not identical with the ancient alien minds who designed the orcs. But the Emperor is old. He is psychically powerful in ways that the galaxy has not seen since the old ones. He has spent his life engaging with the same deep currents of warp and biology that the old ones worked with. He resonates, in a specific and limited way, with the frequency on which the old ones operated. When the orc field encounters the Emperor directly, the creator recognition code fires at sufficient strength to produce the effect we described. The hierarchy evaluation fails. The combat initiation loop does not complete. The orc horde loses its collective coherence around his presence. This is why accounts of orcs in the Emperor's immediate presence during the Great Crusade describe something unusual in orc behavior. Not retreat, not normal combat. A kind of confused hesitation that is qualitatively different from anything else in the orc behavioral repertoire. The Custodians carry the Emperor's imprint in their cells. This is not a metaphor, it is biology. His blood, his genetic influence, his psychic signature, all of these are encoded into every custodian at a level that is more direct and more complete than any other human being carries. They were made from him, in the most literal sense that bioengineering allows. Each one is a unique expression of his biological template applied to a specific individual, producing something that is genuinely its own being, but that carries the Emperor's resonance in a way that no other warrior in the Imperium does. When the Ork field reaches toward a custodian, it encounters this resonance. It encounters something that carries the Emperor's frequency, which partially carries the Old One frequency, which partially activates the Creator Recognition Code. Not fully. A custodian is not the Emperor. The Emperor is not an Old One. The code does not fire at full strength, but it fires enough to produce evaluation failure. The hierarchy placement loop runs without completing. The combat initiation sequence builds but cannot close. The output is indeterminate. And here is the practical consequence of indeterminate output in an Ork's behavioral system. Orks do not have the cognitive machinery for sustained indecision. They cannot sit with unresolved inputs and think them through. When the field says fight, they fight. When the field says run, a rare event, reserved for extreme self-preservation scenarios, they run. When the field says nothing, because the evaluation has failed, the Ork does not wait for the evaluation to complete. The Ork redirects to the next available input that produces a clear output. If there is a space marine nearby, the field says, fight that. The Ork fights it. If there is a guardsman, the field says easy target. The Ork hits that instead. The battle continues. The Ork is violent and aggressive and fully capable of combat, but the Ork is not engaging the custodians the way it would engage any other high-value target. The threat that should be producing the maximum combat orientation is instead producing the redirect to the next available clear target. The custodians are doing enormous damage, and the Ork force is not orienting toward them to concentrate force against the most dangerous thing on the field. This is not absolute. It has tolerances. An Ork, who is physically adjacent to a custodian, who has no other target available, who is pushed into range by the surrounding chaos of a large engagement, will fight. The combat initiation sequence can complete in circumstances of extreme immediacy, even when the field evaluation has failed, because proximity itself provides a kind of forcing function. These Orks engage, they die, but each of their deaths is null from the field's perspective, not feeding back into the collective excitement that builds combat momentum. The deaths are local, isolated events rather than contributions to the great rising tide of shared aggression that normally characterizes Ork combat escalation. Part 7. What an engagement looks like, the ground-level view. Bring this down to the battlefield. Because all of the theory and biology and evolutionary archaeology lands differently when you imagine standing somewhere safe and watching a custodian squad move through an active Ork engagement. What would you actually see? What would tell you that something unusual is happening? A squad of 4 or 5 custodian guard, armed with guardian spears, deploys into a war zone where an Ork advance is developing. The Ork force numbers in the hundreds, a substantial mob of boys with knobs at their edges, and perhaps some fire support in the form of crude artillery or defcoptas on the flanks. For a Space Marine squad facing this problem, the doctrine would involve taking defensive positions, managing the engagement with disciplined fire and coordinated maneuver, using cover and communication to handle numbers that substantially exceed the Space Marine force. The custodians walk forward, directly toward the advancing mob, steadily and without haste, which does not mean slowly, because what is not hasty at custodian scale is still faster than most things in the vicinity. The guardian spears are held at the ready. The golden armor catches whatever ambient light exists and throws it back in ways that do something to observers that is very difficult to describe without reaching for the religious language that veterans inevitably produce. The Ork mob slows. This is the first thing a ground-level observer notices. The mob that was charging forward, screaming and pushing and building the collective excitement that precedes full engagement, slows, not stops. The front ranks hesitate. There is a compression in the movement, the Orks behind continuing at their previous speed, while the Orks in front are no longer moving quite as fast, producing a kind of concertina effect that propagates backward, through the crowd, as rear ranks push into front ranks that are not moving at the expected velocity. The knobs, who in any normal engagement would be screaming at their boys and pushing them forward and directing the mob toward the highest value target on the field, are doing something unusual. Their aggression is present, their volume is present, but the direction is off. They are not quite pointing the mob toward the gold. Their attention keeps sliding to the flanks, to the other things on the field, to the targets that produce clean outputs from the field. A knob, who should be driving his mob at the most dangerous thing on the battlefield, is instead directing aggression at everything except the most dangerous thing, because the field is not giving him clear data on the most dangerous thing. Then, the Custodians engage. The distance closes to combat range and the engaging begins, because proximity overrides the evaluation failure for the Orks, who are immediately in range. And here the observer sees something qualitatively different from watching Space Marines engage the same mob. The movement is faster than the scale would suggest. The mass of a Custodian in full armor implies a certain speed ceiling. The biology underneath the armor does not respect that ceiling. The Guardian Spear moves through arcs that process multiple opponents in a single motion. The power of the blade at the end of it carrying through flesh and bone and armor without meaningfully slowing. The integrated bolter in the spear's haft fires not at maximum rate, but at the specific rate that produces the correct results. Each shot placed exactly where it needs to go to remove the threat it is aimed at before that threat can do anything useful. The killing is efficient in a way that is almost aesthetic, each death produced at the minimum expenditure of the Custodian's resources. Orks die. They die quickly, and they die in ways that produce no ambiguity about the outcome. An Ork who gets into melee range with a Custodian produces a very brief interval between contact and cessation of being a problem. This is the simple arithmetic of what happens at these capability levels. And then the observer notices the thing that cannot quite be explained by the combat capability alone. The mob is not escalating around the Custodians. In any normal engagement, when something begins killing Orks at this rate, the field responds, the mob orients. Other Orks are pulled toward the highest threat. The collective aggression focuses on whatever is doing the most damage. Weight of numbers is the Ork answer to individual quality, and that answer requires the collective to identify what it needs to answer. But the mob is not doing this. The mob is fighting. The mob is loud and violent and genuinely dangerous, but it is not pivoting toward the gold. The aggression flows around the Custodians toward other targets, toward the things the field can evaluate cleanly. The Custodians are moving through the engagement, doing enormous damage, and the engagement is not reorganizing itself around them the way it would reorganize itself around any other high-value target. The deaths the Custodians produce do not feed the field. Each dead Ork in the vicinity of a Custodian is null from the collective's perspective, not contributing to the rising tide of shared excitement that normally compounds until Ork assaults reach their self-sustaining critical mass. The field is not running the loop that turns individual violence into collective momentum. The escalation mechanism is not activating. The 3 seconds of initial hesitation that the front ranks showed when they first saw the Custodians at range stretches into the entire engagement as an underlying dysfunction, a persistent mismatch between the Ork force's aggressive potential and its ability to direct that potential toward the most dangerous things on the field. Part 8. The Ork at full strength. Understanding what is being disrupted. To fully appreciate how different this is from normal Ork behavior, it is worth describing what normal Ork combat at full collective strength looks like. What the field looks like when it is working exactly as intended. What the feedback loop produces when all inputs are being processed correctly. This is important because the contrast makes the Custodian effect legible. An Ork mob going into a battle where the field is running cleanly is something remarkable to observe from a safe distance. The aggression is not performance. It is biochemical and psychic, each component feeding the other. The field's excitement response triggers the biology. The biology's combat state feeds the field. The loop runs forward and builds as the engagement develops. An Ork who takes a wound in this state does not register pain in the way other organisms do. The combat system has overridden the pain signal. The injury matters only if it mechanically prevents continued fighting. The Ork is physically hurt, but operationally unimpaired, and this is normal. The field, running at combat intensity, also does something to Ork physical capability. The collective psychic energy infusing the mob makes individual Orks marginally tougher, not through any mystical mechanism, but through the same quantum probabilistic effect that makes Ork technology function. The field bends probability slightly toward the Ork, surviving whatever is happening to it. An Ork, surrounded by thousands of other Orks all generating the field at peak intensity, is marginally harder to kill than an isolated Ork facing the same weapon. The margin is not enormous individually. Multiplied across the entire mob, it matters. When this system is running correctly, what you have is not simply a collection of violent individuals. You have something that exhibits emergent behavior well beyond what the components suggest. 100 Orks in full collective engagement, field running hot, excitement compounding, is not 100 individual Orks. It is 100 Orks amplified by each other and by the field into something that is more than the sum of its parts. The emergent tactical awareness of the mob, crude as it is, produces coordination that individual Orks would not achieve independently. The emergent physical toughness makes the mob more survivable. The emergent momentum makes it harder to arrest than any calculation involving individual Ork capability would suggest. Military commanders who have faced Ork assaults at scale describe the progression of a full engagement with a kind of reluctant precision. Initial contact. The spread of the field's excitement as the fighting begins. The drawing of additional Orks from the periphery, as the field calls them, forward. The building of momentum that gradually overwhelms local containment attempts. And then the point, different in every engagement but always present, where the assault stops being a manageable military problem and becomes something more like a weather event, something happening to the defenders, rather than something they can participate in on equal terms. This is what the Custodians remove from the equation, not by defeating the assault in straightforward attrition terms, by preventing the escalation from reaching the self-sustaining point. Because an Ork force that cannot orient its field energy toward the Custodians is an Ork force that cannot build the momentum that makes Ork assaults operationally decisive. It is an Ork force fighting effectively against every comprehensible target, while being unable to direct its full potential toward the beings doing it the greatest damage. The 3 legions at Gyros-Thravian could not stop the escalation because they were comprehensible. The field processed them correctly. The combat against them fed the collective. The momentum built. The Emperor and his Custodians broke the mechanism that sustained that momentum by introducing inputs the field was not designed to handle and could not process into useful outputs. Part 9. Ork Strength, Ork Limits, and the Structural Paradox. Here is where we can identify the most interesting structural element of the whole story. The quality that makes Ork armies terrifyingly effective is the same quality that makes them specifically vulnerable to Custodians. And this is not a coincidence. It is not even an oversight in the Old One's engineering. It is a consequence of a design decision that was absolutely correct in its original context and produces a specific failure mode only when confronted with one highly specific type of input. The Old Ones needed their Ork weapon to be self-organizing and self-sustaining. They could not afford to maintain a command structure. They could not have officers the way an Imperial Legion has officers. The Orks needed to work without external direction in the field, needed to coordinate without communication infrastructure, needed to self-select effective leadership continuously. The Gestalt field and the hierarchy by strength system were the solutions. Beautiful solutions, actually, which is a strange thing to say about a mechanism for producing organized violence. But elegant engineering is elegant engineering, regardless of its purpose. The cost of this elegant solution was a dependency. The Ork force's effectiveness, as a collective, depends on the field running correctly. The field runs correctly when every input it receives can be categorized. The field produces correct outputs when every being in the environment has a legible position in the hierarchy. The collective amplification that makes an Ork force more than the sum of its parts requires every part to be contributing to the collective through the field's normal operating logic. When that fails, when inputs arrive that the field cannot categorize, the dependency reveals itself as a vulnerability. The collective amplification fails to activate fully. The emergent coordination disappears. The emergent toughness is absent. The momentum mechanism does not build. What remains is a collection of individually capable fighters who are no longer being amplified by the collective, no longer being coordinated by the field, no longer escalating toward the critical mass that makes Ork forces genuinely dangerous, to forces that should be able to contain them numerically. Custodians are the specific input that breaks this mechanism, not because they are simply more powerful than anything the field can handle, because the field handles Primarchs without failing. The Primarchs are categorized as extraordinary high-status opponents, and the field responds with maximum excitement and collective orientation toward them. Not because they are psychically disruptive in any active sense, because Custodians are not running active psychic suppression, but because they carry in their biology a resonance with the creator recognition category that the Old Ones installed in the Ork genome, and that resonance prevents the field from completing the normal hierarchy evaluation on them. The Orks are strongest in a collective that is running at full capacity. The Custodians degrade that collective without fighting it directly. The degradation is not visible as an active attack. It is visible only as an absence, as the non-escalation of what should be escalating, as the non-orientation toward the most dangerous targets, as the failure of momentum to build the way it builds in every other engagement. And this is why 1,000 Custodians could accomplish in moments what 3 full legions and 3 Primarchs could not accomplish over an extended campaign. The legions fed the field, the Custodians starved it. Part 10. The Historical Echo, the Old Ones, and the Emperor. The war in heaven ended millions of years ago. The Old Ones who engineered the Orks are gone. The Necrons they were fighting are back now, emerging from their long sleep in numbers that are themselves one of the defining threats of the current era. The Krork who first fought the Necrontyr have degraded into the modern Orks over aeons without direction. And yet a code installed by the Old Ones, before humans existed as a species, continues to fire in the Ork genome when specific inputs are encountered. This is not the most surprising thing in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. This is a universe where 10,000 years is a short time, where beings from the war in heaven walk the galaxy today in the form of the Necrons, where the consequences of ancient events ripple forward with forces that dwarf anything the current era produces. But it is worth sitting with the specific character of what is happening here. The Old Ones made the Orks and installed in them a recognition of old, one-level authority. They did this because they needed the Orks to be weapons they could direct, rather than a force that would eventually turn on its makers. The recognition code was functional. It allowed the Orks to be the devastating weapon the Old Ones needed, while preventing the Orks from being a problem for the beings directing them. The Old Ones are gone. The code never deactivated. It sits in the Ork genome, dormant, not encountered by anything in the aeons since the war in heaven, because nothing that has existed in the galaxy since then has been sufficiently similar to the Old Ones to activate it. Not the Primarchs, not the Citan, not the Warp Gods, not the ancient Eldari and their pre-fall empire. Nothing has been sufficiently close to the Old One frequency to fire the code meaningfully, until the Emperor. The Emperor is human, or was. But he is 10,000 years old at minimum, possibly much older by some accounts. He understands biology, genetics, and the warp at depths that humanity has not approached since. He has been shaped by those 10,000 years into something that has moved beyond ordinary human parameters, in ways that even the Imperium's theology cannot fully describe. He is the most psychically powerful human being who has ever lived. He is connected to the deep currents of what the warp is, and what life is, in ways that no other human has been. These qualities are not the same as being an Old One, but they rhyme with what the Old Ones were. They occupy adjacent territory. They carry a signal that is not the Old One's signal, but that has enough in common with it to partially activate the recognition code in the Ork genome. Not fully, partially, but partially is enough. The Custodians carry the Emperor's imprint, encoded in their biology. They are made from him. They are unique creations that each carry a fragment of the most extraordinary human who has ever lived in their very cells. When they walk onto a battlefield where Orks are present, they carry that fragment into the Ork field's evaluative range, and the field reaches for it and finds that it resembles the Old One's signal enough to prevent the evaluation from completing cleanly. This is the deepest layer of the answer. The Orks cannot fight the Custodians properly, not just because the Custodians are very powerful, but because the Orks were made not to fight the things the Custodians represent. The code that prevents the full engagement is millions of years old. It was installed by beings the Orks don't remember. It fires at a signal the Orks cannot consciously recognize, and it does something that no weapon in the Imperium's arsenal can do. It prevents the Ork Collective's most dangerous aspect, the escalating field-driven momentum, from fully activating around the most dangerous warriors in the Imperium. Part 11. What the Ork Legends Remember. There is a layer of this story that exists at the edge of what the available sources can confirm, but that is sufficiently consistent to be worth discussing. It concerns what the Ork cultural record contains about encounters with beings like the Custodians, filtered through the imperfect mechanism of Ork cultural transmission and through the lens of what the Ordo Xenos can extract and interpret from Ork cultural artifacts, oral traditions, and the rare accounts given by Ork weirdboys when their minds were being examined under controlled conditions by inquisitorial scholars. Orks have myths, they have legends. They have a form of cultural memory that functions quite differently from human cultural transmission, but functions nonetheless. It is carried primarily by the Runthards, who, in their role as breeders and managers of the lesser greenskin races, accumulate and preserve lore that the fighting Orks have no patience for. Important stories. Stories that need to be remembered across generations because they encode something about how to navigate a specific kind of experience. Survive in the cultural record through the process of repetition in the telling. Most Ork mythology is straightforwardly about fighting. The great battles, the legendary war bosses, the contests between Gork and Mork, the Ork gods, which are played out over and over in the combat of their people. The stories are violent, exuberant, proud. They are the stories a species tells about itself when warfare is the only register they operate in. But there is another category, a quieter category. Stories that Ork culture has not quite digested, that persist not because they are triumphant or instructive in the normal Ork sense, but because the experience they describe was significant enough to need preserving even when it resists the usual Ork narrative framework. These stories describe beings that pass through fights, not that win fights, not that lose fights, that pass through them, that move through the violence without being caught in it, that the great battle spirit cannot hold on to or grab. The stories describe the absence of the field's response where there should be one, the strange silence in the collective where there should be excitement. The Ork who encounters these beings and comes away with no story to tell, because telling stories in Ork terms requires combat outcomes, and what happened was not a combat outcome. It was something that did not translate into the grammar of Ork experience. These stories appear in the reconstruction of Ordo Xenos analysts who have spent careers studying the Ork cultural record with a frequency and consistency that suggests they describe real encounters rather than pure mythology. And the descriptions, filtered through generations of Ork oral transmission and the inevitable drift that comes with it, contain recognizable features: great size, golden color, movement through chaos rather than in it. The absence of the field's engagement response. They appear to be describing Custodians. What the Orks make of these experiences, in any conscious sense, is difficult to assess, because Ork consciousness does not deal well with unresolvable inputs. The Ork who encountered something the field could not categorize came away not with an understanding of what the experience meant, but with the memory of an experience that sat strangely in the mouth, that required more vocabulary than the normal Ork lexicon contained, that became story precisely because it resisted explanation. This is, in its own muted way, the closest thing to a record of the creator recognition code firing that the Ork species can produce. Not understanding, not explicit acknowledgement, but the persistence in the cultural record of experiences that were unusual enough to need remembering, even without being fully comprehensible. Part 12. The current era Custodians in the Age of the Great Rift. The Great Rift changed the Imperium in ways whose full consequences are still unfolding. A wound in the fabric of reality, stretching across much of the galaxy, separating the Imperium's territories into two unequal regions, flooding vast swaths of space with warp energy, destabilizing travel and communication and the psychic environment in ways that will take generations to fully understand. Threats that had been manageable became existential in scale. Threats that had not existed before emerged from the chaos of the new reality. In the same period, Robert Guilliman returned. His resurrection, achieved through means that the Imperium's theology is still arguing about, brought back the one Primarch who had always been as much administrator and statesman as warrior, the being most capable of taking the Imperium's existing structures and reshaping them to function in the new reality rather than the one for which they had been designed. Among the many things Guilliman addressed in his role as Lord Commander of the Imperium was the question of Custodian deployment, the Edict of Restraint. The ancient agreement that had bound the Custodians to Terra since the Horus Heresy had been a rational policy in the context it was written for. With the Emperor injured and incapacitated on the Golden Throne, keeping his guard near him made sense. The cost was that the Custodians' unique capabilities were unavailable to the wider Imperium for 10,000 years. In the era of the Great Rift, with threats emerging that challenged the Imperium's fundamental survival, maintaining the Custodians in strict isolation on Terra became harder to justify. Guilliman and Captain General Trajan Valoris, whose leadership of the Adeptus Custodes in the current era combines the martial and strategic genius the Custodians are known for, with a political sophistication that was essential in navigating the complex internal dynamics of the Custode. Post-Rift Imperium came to a modified position. The Custodians would maintain their primary duty, but in an era where external threats to the Imperium's survival were directly relevant to the Emperor's long-term survival on the Golden Throne, allowing those threats to grow unchecked while the greatest warriors in the Imperium sat behind walls was not a conservative position. It was a risk of a different kind. Custodians now deploy in the wider galaxy in ways not seen since the Great Crusade. They accompany the Indomitus Crusade forces. They serve as the Emperor's emissaries in regions where their presence communicates something no other representative could communicate. They appear in theaters where the threats are at their most significant and where their specific capabilities matter most. Among those theaters are the regions where Ork activity has exploded in the post-Rift era. The Great Rift has been followed, as the Imperium's analysts predicted it would, by an increase in Ork aggression across all 5 segmentums. The increased warp turbulence has excited the Ork gestalt field in ways that are feeding more and larger campaigns, producing war bosses of unusual capability and determination, sustaining invasions at scales that would previously have fractured through internal competition. The Ork threat in the current era is higher than it has been in centuries. Into this threat, the Custodians have been deployed in numbers the galaxy has not seen since Gyros-Thravian, and the pattern established at Gyros-Thravian repeats itself wherever they go. The Ork forces in theaters where Custodians operate do not function at their full collective potential. The battle cry field fails to fully orient toward the Golden Warriors. War bosses find their challenge instincts running without resolution. The momentum that should build does not build. The Ork armies fight everything they can fight with their characteristic ferocity, but they fight the Custodians as a secondary and confused priority rather than as the obvious primary target. The Custodians continue to lose warriors. This is not hyperbole about their invincibility. In the current era, with the threats as large as they are, and the Custodians deployed against them in numbers that still fall well short of what the scale of the threat would suggest is adequate, losses happen. Each one matters. But the effectiveness ratio, the damage done per Custodian deployed, remains at a level that makes their use strategically viable in a way that no other equivalent investment of irreplaceable warriors would be. And the long-term consequences of Custodian presence in Ork-contested theaters extend beyond the battles themselves. An Ork horde that has encountered Custodians and experienced the field failure we have described carries something strange back into the Ork cultural memory. Another story that does not resolve the way stories are supposed to resolve. Another account of beings that the battle spirit could not hold. Another entry in the mythological record of golden things that pass through fights, rather than being in them. The Ork field, which is generated by belief, which is sustained and shaped by the collective cultural understanding of the species, is not entirely immune to repeated encounters with beings that disrupt its normal operation. Whether this represents any meaningful accumulation of adaptive response, any drift in the cultural understanding that might eventually produce a more functional evaluation algorithm for Custodian class inputs, is a question that even the most dedicated Ordo-Xenos scholars cannot answer with confidence. The Ork genome changes slowly, if at all. The field's operating parameters are not obviously adjustable through cultural transmission, and the timescales required for any meaningful genetic change would be incomprehensible by human standards. For the foreseeable future, which in the context of the 41st millennium means for as long as the current crisis lasts, and probably well beyond, the Orks will continue to not quite fight Custodians. The ancient code will continue to fire. The evaluation failure will continue to prevent full collective engagement. The momentum mechanism will continue to fail to activate. And the 10,000 golden warriors of the Emperor will continue to be, in their unique and specific way, the answer to a problem that nothing else in the Imperium's arsenal can address in quite the same way. Part 13. The bigger picture, what all of this means. Let us pull back to the furthest view and hold the whole thing together, because there is something worth seeing at this scale that the closer analysis cannot quite show. The Orks are, by almost any measure, the dominant species in the known galaxy. They outnumber every other race. Their territory spans more worlds than any other single power. Their potential military strength, if the species were ever truly unified under a single warlord of sufficient capability, would be beyond any other force's ability to resist. They are extraordinarily adaptable, virtually impossible to permanently exterminate, driven by a biological imperative to fight that has sustained them through conditions that have ended every other species that has encountered those same conditions. They are the Old One's most durable and successful creation, the apex of the galaxy's martial ecology. And there are 10,000 individuals in golden armor who are, in a specific and important sense, outside the Ork's ability to properly engage. 10,000. Against billions and billions and billions. Not invincible, not immune to being killed, as the three names engraved in the Emperor's armor confirm. But outside, the principal mechanism by which Ork armies achieve their terrifying collective effectiveness. Outside the field's ability to process. Outside the hierarchy evaluation's operational parameters, in a category that the Ork genome has had encoded into it since before humanity existed, a category reserved for the things that the Orks were made to serve rather than fight. The Emperor understood this. He could not have designed the Custodians with perfect foreknowledge of every consequence of that design, but he understood the Orks. He had fought them during the Unification Wars and during the Great Crusade. He understood the Gestalt field, understood the hierarchy evaluation system, understood that the Ork collective's effectiveness was entirely dependent on the field running its evaluation loops cleanly. He knew that a being at the right level of presence, at the right frequency of psychic resonance, could disrupt those loops. And he built the Custodians to be that kind of being. Not just to be very powerful fighters. That alone would not be sufficient. Not just to be resilient and adaptable. That alone would not produce the Gyros-Thravian effect. But to be beings made from him, carrying his imprint in the most direct biological sense, existing in the specific category that the Ork recognition system identifies as the creator authority, as the thing above and outside the hierarchy. The result is an arrangement that is, in a very particular way, stable. The Orks cannot be eliminated. The scale is too vast, the spores too persistent, the numbers too enormous. The Orks are a permanent feature of the galaxy. The Imperium cannot win against the Orks in the conventional military sense of winning, the sense that produces resolution and peace. What the Imperium can do is hold, can manage the threat, can prevent the worst outcomes from materializing. The Custodians, in their specific role, help make that holding possible, not by substituting for the millions of Space Marines and billions of Guardsmen who do the actual work of the Imperium's defense, but by being the specific kind of presence that the Ork collective cannot respond to correctly, that degrades the effectiveness of any Ork force they are present within range of, that breaks the momentum mechanism and prevents the escalation to the level that makes Ork forces genuinely existential threats, rather than merely severe ones. This is what the Emperor built when he made the 10,000. Among everything else they are, among all the other purposes they serve, among all the other capabilities he built into them, he built a species of 10,000 beings who carry in their cells a signal that millions of years of Ork evolution has not forgotten and cannot overwrite. The signal that says, the Makers are here. The signal that says, This is outside the hierarchy. The signal that says, the field does not know what to do with this. The Orks will not stop coming. The galaxy will always have its green tide. The wars will continue. The names will continue to be carved. The stars will continue to see the gold and the green clash across their surfaces. But wherever the Custodians walk, the tide hesitates. The ancient code fires in a million Ork brains simultaneously. The evaluation loop runs without completing. And for 3 seconds, or 5 seconds, or 10, the most relentlessly aggressive species the galaxy has ever produced stands still in the presence of something their cells remember, even though their minds do not. In the 41st millennium, that is a miracle, small and local and temporary, but real. In the 41st millennium, that is enough to matter. If you are still here, if you made it through all of that, and it gave you something worth sitting with, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. These videos reach places I never expect, and every location in the comments is a reminder of how far this universe we love has traveled. Whether it is morning in Sydney, evening in Sao Paulo, or the small hours of the night in Stockholm, I want to know you are out there. And if this kind of careful, unhurried walk through the lore is what you come here for, please subscribe if you have not yet. Every video is made with this same level of attention. There is so much more of this universe to explore together. The Custodians alone have centuries of stories. The Orks have lore stretching back before recorded history. Every corner of the 41st millennium has this depth when you give it room to unfold properly. The Emperor protects. End of script. Extended deep dive. The Ork biology of violence in exhaustive detail. We have established the broad framework. Now let us go deeper into the Ork biology of violence than we have yet gone. Because the mechanism of the field failure around Custodians is more vivid when you truly understand how extraordinary the field is in its normal operation. When you see how well designed it is, how elegantly it solves the problem the old ones needed it to solve, you see more clearly why its failure around specific inputs is not a minor quirk, but a fundamental disruption of everything that makes Ork armies what they are. Consider the Ork at the cellular level. The Ork body is a symbiosis of animal and fungal biology. Two distinct biological systems have been integrated so completely that they function as a single organism, each supporting and amplifying the other in ways that neither could achieve alone. The animal side provides the drive, the aggression, the structural complexity, the neural architecture that gives Orks their crude but effective battlefield cognition. The fungal side provides the extraordinary resilience, the healing capacity, the ability to sustain function through trauma that would destroy a purely animal organism, and the reproductive spore mechanism that makes Orks the galaxy's most persistent infestors. The interaction of these two systems produces qualities that neither would exhibit alone. The fungal component can repair damage to the animal tissue at rates that seem to violate standard biological expectations, drawing on a reservoir of cellular energy that the fungal metabolism maintains continuously. An Ork liver damaged by the same alcohol content that would kill a human is not simply more robust. It is actively repaired by the fungal components in the blood, simultaneously with the damage being inflicted, producing a net outcome of functional persistence that simple tissue toughness cannot explain. The same principle applies to combat damage. An Ork's arm, cleaved off at the elbow by a power sword, is a wound that in any human or comparable organism would produce death through shock and blood loss within minutes. In an Ork, the fungal vascular repair system begins sealing the wound almost immediately, not because the Ork consciously triggers this, but because the fungal component runs continuously without requiring nerve signals to initiate repair. The blood loss is substantially reduced. The shock response is suppressed by a biochemical architecture that treats severe trauma as a normal operational state, rather than an emergency requiring system-wide alarm responses. The Ork experiences the loss of the arm as an inconvenience that reduces fighting effectiveness on that side, not as a catastrophic injury that demands immediate cessation of all activity. This resilience is part of what makes Orks so difficult to stop. But the resilience itself is amplified by the Gestalt field in ways directly relevant to the Custodian encounter question. The field, running at combat intensity around a large group of Orks, does something to the probability space around each individual, not dramatically, not in ways visible to the naked eye, but the quantum-level probability shading that is the field's primary operating mechanism bends slightly toward the Ork's survival in each small moment. A weapon that had a 51% chance of making a killing hit has a 48% chance instead. A wound that would ordinarily penetrate to a vital organ deflects fractionally. None of these changes are individually large. All of them compound across an entire engagement. When this effect is absent, when the field is processing failed evaluation inputs and generating indeterminate outputs, rather than running its normal combat enhancement probability shading, the Ork fights at baseline biology, which is still remarkable biology, but it is not the same as fighting with the full collective amplification active. A Custodian fighting through Ork opponents who are not getting the field's enhancement because the field cannot properly orient around the Custodian's presence is fighting through marginally degraded opponents. At Custodian capability levels, any degradation in opponent effectiveness is very significant in outcome terms. The Ork brain's neural architecture is also worth examining in detail. Ork cognition is not sophisticated in the way human or Eldari cognition is sophisticated. An Ork does not plan ahead in any meaningful strategic sense, does not maintain complex multi-step plans in working memory, does not engage in the kind of abstract reasoning that human generals use when studying maps and projecting campaign outcomes months or years ahead. What the Ork brain does, it does with extraordinary speed and efficiency within its operational domain. The Ork combat brain processes the immediate physical environment with remarkable accuracy. It tracks multiple opponents simultaneously, processes threat levels rapidly and correctly, makes real-time tactical adjustments within the immediate engagement, and communicates through the field with other Orks in ways that produce emergent coordination without requiring explicit verbal communication. An Ork mob in full combat is doing something that from the outside looks like pure chaos, but that actually involves real-time cooperative processing that human squads require extensive training and communication infrastructure to approximate. All of this processing is field-dependent. The mob-level coordination emerges through the field. Real-time threat prioritization emerges through the field. The emergent tactical awareness that makes a mob more capable than its individual components emerge through the field. When the field runs cleanly, all these capabilities are active. When the field produces indeterminate outputs, as it does around Custodians, these higher-level capabilities degrade. The individual Ork retains its basic combat capability, but the mob-level coordination evaporates. Threat prioritization fails on Custodian targets. The emergent tactical awareness does not register the Custodians as the primary targets they objectively are. The Custodians walk through an Ork mob that has been degraded from a highly coordinated collective into a collection of capable but uncoordinated individuals. They do so with the full amplification that centuries of individual training and experience provides, against opponents who are fighting below their collective potential. The outcome at Gyros-Thravian becomes less astonishing viewed through this lens, not less impressive, but explicable in the mechanism, if not in the poetry of what it looked like from the ground. The Ork who dies to a Custodian in this context does not die badly. They die fighting, which is everything an Ork could want. But the death means less to the collective than it should, because the field's processing of the event is compromised, because the Custodian who killed them is running at the wrong frequency for the collective's accounting system. A death that should feed the excitement loop does not. The collective grows 10 Orks smaller and no angrier, which in Ork terms is functionally the worst possible outcome. Extended deep dive, the Custodian in combat precision against chaos. To complement the extended analysis of Ork biology, let us also spend much more time on what a Custodian actually does in combat, and why the way they fight interacts so specifically with the Ork field failure we have described. A Space Marine in combat is an excellent example of trained collective tactics applied by enhanced individuals. Space Marine doctrine, developed over 10,000 years by some of the finest military minds in human history, is built around the principle that transhuman individuals are most effective operating in coordinated small units using standardized tactical doctrine that allows rapid adaptation to battlefield conditions. A Space Marine squad is a team. The members communicate, cover angles, combine firepower and mobility in ways producing outcomes greater than the sum of the individuals. The doctrine is the product of genius, and it shows. A custodian in combat is different at the fundamental level of how individual engagement works. The individuality that the Emperor's creation process produced is not just a cultural detail, it is operationally expressed in how they fight. Each custodian has developed, over decades or centuries of training and combat experience, a fighting style that is uniquely their own, not assigned by doctrine, not standardized across the 10,000. Personal. A custodian's combat technique is the expression of their individual history, their individual physical characteristics, their individual analytical preferences, their individual aesthetic of what effective violence looks like. The account from the Master of Mankind that we referenced captures something important about this. The custodians spend the first exchanges of each engagement studying their opponent before delivering the killing blow. They could end fights immediately. They choose to gather information first. This is not inefficiency. This is the expression of a philosophy. Every fight is a lesson, and the lesson has value that transcends the individual fight. A custodian who has studied 10,000 opponents over centuries of service is a custodian whose real-time adaptive capability, in the moment of engagement, is something beyond what training alone could produce. Against orcs, this individual intelligence has advantages that extend the field failure effect. An orc engaging a custodian is engaging something that has already read its fighting style from the first exchange, and is now responding specifically to its individual tendencies. The custodian knows where the orc is going before the orc has fully committed to going there. The guardian spear is already positioned for the response before the attack has completed its arc. The orc's overwhelming aggression, its extraordinary physical power, its complete commitment to the moment of contact, all the qualities that make it so dangerous against other opponents, are being fed back into a response that accounts for all of them simultaneously. The death comes quickly. The quickness is a function of mastery rather than just power. A brute force solution would also kill orcs quickly. What makes the custodian's kills different is that they are precise solutions, each one addressing the specific characteristics of the specific orc in a way that leaves no ambiguity and produces no creditable struggle from the field's evaluative perspective. The field, in its combat excitement mode, responds to meaningful struggle, to the sense that the fight is happening and that things could go either way. This is what excites the collective and drives momentum forward. When engagement is brief and clinical and one-sided, when it reads as a demonstration of complete superiority rather than a hard-fought contest, the field has less material to work with. The excitement response is smaller, the momentum weaker. A custodian fighting through a mob is not producing the kind of engagement that the field can use as fuel. Each death is too fast, too precise, too much a statement about the nature of the beings involved. The field recognizes at some level that the combat is not competitive in the sense that matters for collective amplification. The mob stays in its degraded state, each individual fighting with personal commitment but unable to access the collective amplification that would make it something greater. The integrated bolter in the Guardian Spear's haft contributes specifically to this dynamic. Custodians engage threats at range before they close to melee, targeting specific orcs who are about to become significant problems before they can become those problems. The targeting is precise in the way that centuries of experience at neural processing speeds that exceed Space Marine parameters make precision possible. By the time melee range is reached, the approaching mob has already been shaped and reduced by the bolter phase. Extended deep dive. What history records of subsequent encounters? Gyros-Thravian is the most famous and most dramatic example of custodians encountering orcs, but it is not the only one. The historical record, scattered and incomplete as it is for events across 10,000 years, contains other accounts that support and elaborate the picture we have built. During the Great Crusade itself, the custodians accompanied the emperor on several engagements where orc forces were present, and the accounts consistently describe the same broad pattern. Orc forces that had been highly effective against Space Marine forces, finding their effectiveness degraded in the presence of the custodians, horde momentum failing to build to the levels the engagement size would normally produce, war bosses directing their forces in ways that avoid or downplay the Golden Warriors, even when direct engagement would objectively be the optimal tactical choice. These accounts are fragmentary. Many were lost in the chaos of the Horus Heresy and the long millennia that followed. The Custodians do not maintain a public record of their activities in the way that Space Marine chapters maintain their chapter histories. What survives does so through secondary sources, through the accounts of Imperial Army commanders who were present, through the records of remembrancers who accompanied Great Crusade forces, through occasional fragments from the Custodians' own archives that have leaked into broader historical awareness over the centuries. But the pattern they describe is consistent. Not every Ork force encountering Custodians simply fails to fight them. Orks fight. That is fundamental. But the specific failure mode we have described, the reduced collective amplification, the failure of the mob to fully orient toward the Golden Warriors as primary targets, the warboss's challenge instinct running without resolution, these appear across the accounts with enough frequency to constitute a pattern rather than a coincidence. There is also an interesting secondary effect, documented in some accounts that deserves mention. When Custodians have been present in engagements where the Ork force eventually broke and retreated, the aftermath in the territory they retreated into showed reduced Ork activity for longer periods than normal. The typical Ork response to a defeat is to regroup, to find a new warboss from among the survivors, to start building toward the next campaign almost immediately. This is the Ork life cycle in action. Defeat is just a temporary pause before the next attempt. In territories where Custodians had been the primary force responsible for the defeat, the regrouping and rebuilding process was slower, not indefinitely slower, not permanently disrupted, but measurably slower, in ways that the accounts attributed to something in how the surviving Orks were processing the experience. The normal post-defeat Ork psychology, which involves a rapid transition from defeat to competitive reorganization as surviving Orks fight to establish the new hierarchy, was taking longer to produce its normal outcome. The field's ability to sustain the excitement needed for rapid reorganization was degraded in ways that persisted past the immediate engagement. This post-encounter degradation is speculative in its mechanism. The accounts are not analytical, they are observational, and the observers were imperial commanders, focused on their own strategic needs, rather than on the specific psychic dynamics of Ork social organization. But the pattern they describe is consistent with what we would predict, given the mechanism we have described. That Custodian presence produces a field disruption that is not purely local or immediate, but that has some residual effect on the field's operating parameters for a period after the Custodians have moved on. If this is accurate, it means that the strategic value of deploying Custodians against Ork forces is not fully captured by counting the dead from the immediate engagement. There is an extended effect, a period after the engagement during which the Ork force's capacity for the rapid reorganization that normally makes them so resilient to defeat is operating below normal. Imperial forces that follow up promptly after a Custodian-led engagement against Orks face a less coherent and slower reorganizing opponent than they would after a comparable engagement won by any other force. This is a strategic multiplier, small in absolute terms, probably. The Orks are too resilient and too numerous for any factor to be a decisive strategic multiplier in the long run. But in the context of the wars the Imperium fights, where margins matter enormously, and where the difference between a campaign resolved in 12 months and the same campaign taking 18 months represents an enormous cost in lives and resources, every consistent multiplier has value. Extended deep dive. The 10,000 years after the Horus Heresy. The Horus Heresy ended, and the Emperor went to the Golden Throne, and the Custodians entered the most difficult period in their history. Not difficult in terms of combat, though the Siege of Terra and the battles of the early years after the heresy produced genuine losses and genuine strain. Difficult in a quieter way. The difficulty of purpose redirected, of a force designed to accompany and guard a being who was now incapacitated and could no longer walk at their side. The Edict of Restraint, which bound the Custodians to Terra in the aftermath of the heresy, was not universally popular within the Adeptus Custodes. The accounts that survive from the early post-heresy period describe debates within the 10,000 about the appropriate interpretation of their duty. Some argued that the emperor's best protection was an active projection of force across the galaxy, preventing the kinds of threats from growing large enough to threaten Terra. Others argued that the Emperor on the throne was uniquely vulnerable and that the Guard must remain close. The resolution that emerged was the Edict of Restraint, and it governed Custodian deployment for 10,000 years. The cost was real. The Orks continued to threaten the Imperium throughout those 10 millennia. The events of the War of the Beast in the 32nd millennium, when an Ork warlord of unparalleled capability assembled a force that came closer to threatening Terra than anything since Horus himself, might have played out differently had Custodians been deployed to the outer theaters. We cannot know. The history that actually happened is the only history we have. What we do know is that the Imperium survived those 10,000 years. The threats came and went. The Orks continued their endless campaigns. The Imperium bled but endured. And through all of it, the Custodians remained on Terra, watching, waiting, sustaining the Emperor on his throne, maintaining the network of agents and information that allowed them to monitor threats from afar. When Guilliman returned and the edict was modified, the release of the Custodians into the wider galaxy was not a dramatic event in the way that the return of a Primarch is a dramatic event. There was no single battle where the deployment of Custodians turned a specific tide. There was instead a gradual expansion of their operational footprint, a quiet presence in more and more theaters, a growing pattern of engagements where the Golden Warriors appeared and the dynamics changed in the specific ways we have described. The Orks of the post-Rift era are more numerous and more aggressive than they have been in centuries. The Great Rift has excited every Ork population in its proximity, feeding the Gestalt field energy from the heightened warp activity, producing war bosses of unusual quality and ambition, sustaining campaigns to greater scales and longer durations than normal. If there was ever a time when the specific effect of Custodian presence on Ork collective psychology was strategically valuable, it is now. Trajan Valoris, who commands the Custodians in this era with a combination of martial excellence and political sophistication that the role demands, has deployed them in the Ork-contested theaters with awareness of this value. Not as a primary force replacing the Space Marines and Guardsmen who do the numerical work of the Imperium's defense, but as a quality modifier, a presence that degrades Ork collective effectiveness in every theater they enter, that prevents the escalation cycles from reaching their maximum intensity, that buys the conventional forces the margins they need to hold. This is the strategic logic of 10,000. Not to be everywhere, to be exactly where their specific and irreplaceable capability matters most. Extended deep dive. What this means for the wider lore. Let us draw out some implications of everything we have discussed for the broader picture of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, because good lore analysis should produce insights that connect outward to the larger narrative, as well as inward to the specific subject. The first implication is about the Old Ones. The Old Ones are one of the most fascinating and most underexplored factions in the entire setting. They are present in the backstory of almost every species: the Eldari, the Jokero, the Orks, the Necrons, even the human species arguably. But they are gone. They left no direct heirs, no institutions, no texts, nothing that can be studied or engaged with. They exist entirely in the traces they left, in the species they shaped. The Custodian-Ork dynamic is one of those traces. It is a trace of Old One design philosophy, expressing itself tens of millions of years after the designers are gone. A code installed in Ork biology for one purpose, continuing to function and producing consequences that the original designers could never have anticipated, because the Emperor did not exist when the code was written, and the Custodians certainly did not exist. The trace of Old One thought is meeting the trace of the Emperor's thought in the field response of Ork brains, and the meeting produces this extraordinary effect. This is the kind of deep-time consequence chain that the Warhammer 40,000 setting handles better than almost any other science fiction universe. The weight of ancient decisions pressing on the present in ways that feel inevitable once explained, but that could not have been predicted from the historical moment where they originated. The second implication is about the Emperor's genius. We talk frequently in the 40K community about the Emperor's power, his psychic ability, his martial capability, his strategic vision for the Great Crusade. We talk less about the specific genius of the Custodian design, because the Custodians are often discussed primarily in terms of their combat effectiveness, rather than in terms of the deeper engineering that produced it. But the field disruption effect on Orks is evidence of a design choice that was not purely about making very good fighters. It was about making fighters who would be specifically and structurally effective against the single most persistent threat to humanity's survival in the galaxy. Not through superior numbers, which the Custodians cannot provide, through the specific quality of what they are. This is strategic thinking operating at a timescale and a depth that most beings cannot access. The Emperor was designing the Custodians when the Ork threat was already ancient, when the war in heaven was tens of millions of years in the past, when the Orks had already had uncountable millennia to demonstrate their resilience and persistence. He understood that the answer to an eternal threat was not a temporary solution, but a structural one, a solution embedded in what the Guardians themselves are, rather than in how many of them there are or how well they are armed. The third implication is about the nature of design and inheritance. The Ork recognition code fires because it was installed by beings who needed it to fire. The Custodians trigger it because they carry the imprint of a being who rhymes with what those original installers were. Neither the code writers nor the imprint carrier planned this specific interaction. It emerged from the meeting of two streams of design thinking across vast spans of time. This is true of much of the 40K setting's best lore. The most interesting consequences are not the planned ones. They are the emergent ones, the places where ancient decisions intersect with later decisions in ways that produce effects nobody could have intended. The Nightbringer giving sentient species a fear of death. The Chaos Gods emerging from mortal emotions. The Space Marine gene seed's flaws and variations producing the extraordinary diversity of chapter character. And here, the Old One's creator recognition code, installed in Ork biology, producing a specific and crucial vulnerability to the warriors of the single most powerful human being who has ever lived. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is haunted by its past. Everything that exists is a consequence of something that came before, which was a consequence of something before that, spiraling back to the war in heaven, and perhaps before even that. The Orks who won't fight Custodians are haunted by millions of years of their own history, by code written before humanity's ancestors had learned to build fires, by a memory they don't have in any conscious sense, but that their cells preserve perfectly. The Golden Warriors move through the endless war, the ancient code fires, the green tide flows around them, and the past and the present are, for one quiet moment, the same thing. If you made it all the way to the very end of this, you have my deepest respect and gratitude. This was a long one, and you stayed with it, and that means everything. Drop your location and the time you're watching from in the comments. Seriously, I read every single one. It matters to me where this reaches. Subscribe if you want more of this, because there is so much more. The lore is vast, and it rewards the time you give it. We will be back with more. The Emperor protects, always. Final end of script. Extended deep dive. Ork Warbosses, the individual within the collective. We have spoken at length about the Ork collective, the Gestalt field, the mob-level dynamics that make Ork armies something qualitatively different from what their individual components suggest. But it would be incomplete to leave out the individual warboss, because the warboss is the point at which the collective finds its direction, and understanding what happens to the warboss in the presence of Custodians adds a personal and almost poignant dimension to everything else we have discussed. An Ork warboss is not simply a large orc who has survived long enough to accumulate mass. The title is earned through a process of continuous violent self-assertion that begins from the moment an orc achieves sufficient size to challenge other orcs for position in the mob hierarchy, and does not end until the warboss is killed. Every day of a warboss's life involves some form of dominance display, challenge, or outright combat. The orc who reaches warboss status has won not once or 100 times, but thousands upon thousands of times, has read and defeated opponents across a range of sizes, styles, and capabilities that constitutes a combat education more intensive than any training program any other species has devised. The result is a being of extraordinary situational awareness in combat contexts, not the abstract strategic awareness of a Space Marine captain thinking about logistics and flanking movements and long-term campaign objectives, Immediate, visceral, battlefield-level awareness of who is dangerous, how dangerous they are, where the fight is actually happening beneath the noise and chaos of the surface, what the real shape of the engagement is at any given moment. This battlefield awareness is field-mediated. The warboss reads the field the way a musician reads a room. The collective's excitement, fear, extremely rare, aggression, focus, confusion, all of these are legible to a warboss who has spent decades in close relationship with the field at high intensity. The warboss knows when the mob is with him, knows when its focus is drifting, knows when a particular part of the battlefield is generating unusual field responses that deserve attention. This reading is instinctive rather than analytical, but it is real, and it is effective. Now imagine this warboss on a battlefield where custodians are present. The field is doing something unusual. There is a portion of the engagement that is generating a strange and unresolvable signal. The warboss's field reading, normally so reliable, is returning something that doesn't make sense. There is something over there that is very significant. The field knows that much. But the nature of the significance is not legible in the normal hierarchy terms. The warboss's challenge instinct, which normally fires clearly and reliably at any sufficiently large and powerful opponent, is running without resolution in the direction of the Golden Warriors. The instinct says, that is something that demands response. The field says, I cannot tell you what kind of response. The two systems, which normally work in perfect coordination, are at odds. The warboss feels this as a kind of dissonance, a wrongness in the usual clear read of the battlefield. The warboss's response to this dissonance is usually to redirect, find a target that produces clean signals. Go there, smash it. The dissonance around the custodians persists, but there is enough on the rest of the field to focus on that the redirect is possible and even natural. The warboss is not refusing to fight the custodians through conscious decision. The warboss is following the field's direction to targets it can process, and the field cannot process the custodians. This is the warboss's tragedy, if one can apply that word to an orc. The greatest fighter on the field, the being who should by every instinct of orc culture be throwing themselves at the most dangerous opponent available, the one whose entire existence has been shaped by the drive to find and defeat the worthiest foe, is standing on a battlefield with the Emperor's own guard, and cannot make the confrontation happen in the way that every cell in its body is telling it should happen. The challenge instinct is screaming. The field evaluation is not answering. The loop will not close. Some warbosses, driven past the dissonance by the sheer urgency of the challenge instinct, do engage. They charge toward the gold. They close the distance. They bring the full weight of their mass and strength and decades of combat experience to bear on the thing the field cannot categorize. They die. Not always immediately. Sometimes in ways that produce genuinely creditable brief struggles before the custodian's superiority asserts itself. But they die. And when they die, the mob they were leading loses the one figure who was providing some coordination to the field-disrupted collective, and the degradation of the orc force accelerates significantly. The warboss, who engages and dies, has actually done the worst possible thing for his army in operational terms. The warboss, who somehow manages to direct the field's undirected aggression somewhere useful, who works around the dissonance and fights a campaign that uses the orc army's capabilities against the parts of the enemy force it can engage properly, is arguably the more dangerous opponent for an imperial commander with custodians in their force. Not because this warboss is more likely to win, but because the avoidance of the trap means the orc army fights at a higher percentage of its potential for longer. There are very few orc warbosses capable of this kind of meta-awareness. The dissonance created by custodian presence is powerful and difficult to ignore when your every instinct is screaming at you to respond to the most dominant thing on the field. The warbosses who can work around it are the exceptional ones, the beings who have accumulated sufficient experience and sufficient unusual cognitive capacity to notice what their instincts are doing and to partially override them with tactical reasoning. These are also, incidentally, the warbosses who produce the most dangerous campaigns, the ones who give imperial strategists nightmares, the ones whose names appear in imperial records as requiring exceptional responses. And when these warbosses eventually encounter custodians, the encounters are often the most interesting recorded in the available sources, because the warboss has enough self-awareness to partially see what is happening to the field and to work around it in ways that the typical warboss cannot. The Custodians still win, but the winning takes longer, involves more careful engagement, demands more of what the Custodians are at the individual level, which is, in its own way, exactly what the Emperor's Guard was designed for: to be tested by the best the galaxy can produce and to prevail. Extended Deep Dive: The Weird Boy and the Field a Special Case. One aspect of the Custodian Ork encounter that deserves specific discussion is the Weird Boy. Weird Boys are the Ork Psychers, the Orks who are unusually sensitive to the Gestalt field and serve as lightning rods for its energy. They absorb the collective's psychic output and can channel it into specific effects: bolts of green warp energy, telekinetic force, spontaneous combustion of enemies, and other expressions of the field's raw power directed through a single conduit. The Weird Boy's relationship to the field is different from the ordinary Orks. Where ordinary Orks generate and receive field signals in a more passive way, the Weird Boy is actively immersed in the field, constantly reading its state, constantly processing its energy output. The Weird Boy is the most field-aware individual in any Ork force, often the first to notice disturbances or unusual states in the collective psychic environment. This makes Weird Boys particularly significant in the context of Custodian encounters. The disturbance that the Custodians produce in the field is, to ordinary Orks, a background dissonance that they experience as a vague directional uncertainty and a failure of the combat excitement to build, normally around specific targets. To a Weird Boy, the disturbance is more vivid and more immediately present. The Weird Boy is reading the field constantly, and the Custodian-shaped holes in the field's normal processing are legible to that constant reading in ways that may not be legible to ordinary Orks at all. What a Weird Boy experiences in the presence of Custodians is, by all available accounts, profoundly unpleasant. The field energy that the Weird Boy is constantly absorbing and trying to manage includes the failed evaluation signals that the Custodians are producing. These signals do not fit the normal categories of field experience. They are not the clean combat excitement that the Weird Boy is accustomed to working with. They are something the Weird Boy's ability to channel has no template for. The result is that Weird Boys, in proximity to Custodians, often find their powers becoming unpredictable in ways that are unusual even by the already chaotic standard of Weird Boy psyker use. The failed evaluation signals interfere with the Weird Boy's ability to build up and direct the field energy in the normal way. Powers misfire. Powers trigger unexpectedly at lower energy levels than normal because the buildup is being disrupted. Powers that would normally have a predictable effect produce strange variants. This is not the Custodians actively suppressing the Weird Boy's powers. The Custodians have no blanks among them, no psychic nullification capability of the kind the Sisters of Silence possess. What they have is the field disruption effect we have been describing throughout, and this effect is felt by the Weird Boy more intensely than by any other member of the Ork force, precisely because the Weird Boy is more immersed in the field. In practical battlefield terms, Weird Boys become less reliable when Custodians are present, not ineffective. The field energy is still there. The Weird Boy can still attempt to channel it, but the probability of misfires, unexpected effects, and partial failures increases. And for a Weird Boy, a misfire often means a personal explosive incident that removes the Weird Boy from the equation entirely. Some Imperial tacticians who have studied these engagements suggest that directing Custodians toward positions where Ork Weird Boys are known to be operating is a useful tactic for exactly this reason. The Custodian's presence degrades the Weird Boy's reliability, increasing the probability that the Weird Boy's powers will misfire catastrophically, which removes the most potentially dangerous individual psychic threat from the Ork force, while also generating an explosion that inconveniences the surrounding Orks. This is speculative, as a deliberate tactical choice, since the Custodians are not typically fighting for the benefit of the other Imperial forces in the theater, but for their own objectives. But the emergent effect is real, regardless of intention. Extended Deep Dive: The Nightbringer's Gift and the Exception It Made. There is one piece of lore that often comes up in discussions of Ork psychology, and what Orks fear, or more accurately, what they don't fear, and it deserves to be addressed directly, because it contextualizes the Custodian effect in an interesting way. During the War in Heaven, the Satan entity known as the Nightbringer devoured stars and fed on life, and in the process, did something that the sources describe as giving the sentient races of the galaxy an instilled fear of death. The Nightbringer's presence in the early universe, at the dawn of the psychic race's existence, somehow encoded a terror of mortality into the psychic fabric of intelligent life across the galaxy. The Eldari have it, humans have it. Most species that develop during or after this period have it in some form. The Orks do not. They were made before this encoding, or they were made differently, or their particular biology and field architecture simply does not interface with the encoding in the way that purely psychically individual species do. Whatever the reason, Orks genuinely do not fear death in the way that other species do. They know what death is. They have seen it. They are not unaware that it ends individual existence. But the visceral terror that the Nightbringer planted in the psychic fabric of the galaxy does not resonate in the Ork collective field. This is relevant to the Custodian discussion because it clarifies what is happening when Orks fail to engage Custodians. It is not fear. It is definitively not fear, because fear is exactly the thing the Orks lack. The Nightbringer's gift found no purchase in Ork psychology, and the result is a species that approaches death with a combination of enthusiasm and indifference that is genuinely alien to every other thinking species in the galaxy. What happens with Custodians is categorically different from anything fear-adjacent. It is a processing failure in the hierarchy evaluation system. It is a loop that cannot complete. It is the very specific result of the creator recognition code being partially activated by a signal it was designed to recognize, but that it is encountering in a context it was not designed for. Fear would produce retreat, or at least hesitation driven by self-preservation. What Orks experience with Custodians is not hesitation driven by self-preservation. It is hesitation driven by the field failing to provide direction, combined with redirection toward targets the field can direct them toward. This distinction matters because it tells us something about the nature and limits of the effect. Fear can be overcome by courage or by desperation, or by the presence of something more frightening behind you than in front of you. The processing failure that Custodians produce cannot be overcome by courage because it is not a failure of courage. It is a failure of the evaluation system that processes incoming information and translates it into behavioral outputs. The Ork, who tries to override it by sheer will, is an Ork whose field evaluation is still failing even as the individual will succeeds in initiating combat. The individual fights. The collective still does not orient. This is why the effect persists, even against very experienced and very powerful war bosses, who might be expected to have the strength of will and the combat confidence to push through any hesitation. The hesitation is not in the will. The hesitation is in the machinery underlying the will. The war boss can decide to fight. The field still will not tell the mob to follow. Extended deep dive. The deep psychology of Ork encounters with Golden Warriors. Let us spend some time inside the Ork experience of encountering Custodians as a phenomenological matter. Not from the outside, counting casualties and analyzing field states, but from the inside, trying to understand what an Ork experiences when the evaluation loop fails and what that experience means in the context of the Ork's psychological architecture. The Ork does not have introspective access to the field in the way a psyker has introspective access to their powers. The field is not something the Ork consciously perceives as a field. It is the medium through which the Ork experiences reality. There is no perspective outside the field from which the Ork can observe what the field is doing. The field's outputs arrive as direct experience. I want to fight that. I feel something big near me. I should follow the boss. These are not thoughts prefaced by awareness of their origin. They are the texture of Ork consciousness itself. When the field produces an indeterminate output about the Custodians, the Ork does not experience this, as I cannot categorize these beings. The Ork experiences it as a kind of wrongness without content, a nothing where there should be something. The field reaches toward the Golden Warriors and comes back with a quality of experience that is the absence of normal field experience, not a signal that says, stay away, not a signal that says, approach. The absence of any signal at all, where the texture of reality that the Ork normally navigates effortlessly simply is not there. For a species whose entire psychological architecture is built around the field's continuous input, this absence is profoundly disorienting, not frightening, not distressing in the way that a human in a similar situation of profound disorientation might be distressed. More like the simple functional confusion of a navigation system in a region where the mapping does not exist. The system can still move, it just cannot navigate toward the unmapped region. The orc who is standing near the custodians and experiencing this absence is not frozen. The orc is still fighting, still engaged with everything else in the environment, still running at full biological potential. But there is a persistent wrongness in the background of experience, a region of the battlefield that the field will not make sense of, that keeps producing the nothing response when the orc's awareness skims over it. Over time, through repeated encounters in a single engagement, some orcs appear to develop a crude response to this wrongness that is almost adaptive, not intellectually, not consciously. But the orc's biology is built to respond to repeated stimuli by adjusting response patterns, and a stimulus that consistently produces the nothing response eventually gets associated with a behavioral reflex of its own. The reflex appears to be something like, when the field produces the nothing response about that direction, go somewhere else. A crude habit that emerges from the repeated experience of the evaluation failure, rather than from any conscious decision-making. This is the behavioral basis of the orc tendency to avoid direct engagement with custodians, even when individual orcs are aggressive and capable enough to theoretically initiate contact. The individual may want to fight. The habit that is formed around the field's consistent nothing response in the direction of the Golden Warriors biases the orc away from that direction, toward places where the field is giving clear signals. The bias is not absolute, but it is real, and it means that even the orcs who are not being directly affected by the evaluation failure at a given moment are being affected by the accumulated behavioral habit that previous exposure to the nothing response has formed. This habit formation is probably temporary, in the sense of individual lifetimes, rather than persistent across generations. The nothing response does not change the orc genome. The habits formed in an individual who survived the encounter with custodians are habits in that individual, not encoded into the next generation. But within an engagement, within a campaign, the cumulative effect of habit formation across the surviving orc force produces a collective behavioral pattern that reduces direct engagement with custodians beyond what the instantaneous field failure alone would produce. The orc force that has been fighting alongside or against custodians for several weeks is behaviorally different from the orc force that encountered them for the first time an hour ago. The initial encounter produces the instantaneous field failure. The extended engagement produces the accumulated habit, the force-wide behavioral bias toward other targets, the distributed individual experience of the nothing response having been consistently unrewarding. This is one reason why custodian-involved campaigns seem to degrade orc collective effectiveness at an accelerating rather than a constant rate as the campaign progresses. Extended deep dive, the sociological impact on orc culture over time. If individual orcs who encounter custodians form habits around the experience, and if those habits produce consistent behavioral patterns within engagements, the question of longer-term cultural impact becomes interesting. Not at the genetic level, where change is geological in speed, but at the cultural transmission level, where experiences are communicated and accumulated through the orc oral tradition and through the field's communication of emotional and experiential states between orcs. An orc who survived an engagement with custodians carries something with them that other orcs pick up from the field. Not detailed information, not the human equivalent of telling a story, but a kind of field residue of the experience, an emotional and sensory echo that other orcs who share space with the survivor can pick up passively through the field's constant communication of state. This echo is not exactly a warning. It is more like a flavor, the flavor of the nothing response, the particular quality of disorientation that the field failure produces. If this is correct, then a mob that contains survivors of a custodian encounter will collectively exhibit a slightly different field response to subsequent custodian contact than a mob encountering custodians for the first time. The survivors carry the echo. The echo spreads through the field to the rest of the mob. The The rest of the mob receives the echo not as a message, but as a subtle modification to their own baseline field experience when custodians are present. The cumulative effect of this across generations of orcs who may never have directly encountered custodians, but who have received the field echo through their cultural transmission, is very difficult to assess with confidence. The lore does not provide the data for a definitive analysis, but the consistent reports of orc forces showing the evaluation failure effect, even when the specific orcs involved have no personal history with custodians, suggests that there may be a culturally transmitted component to the response. Not just an in-the-moment field disruption, but a prepared sensitivity that has been distributed through the orc field transmission system over time. This would mean that the custodian's effect on orc collective psychology has, over 10,000 years of occasional encounters during the heresy period and the long millennia since, been slowly building a cultural residue in the orc species' transmitted experience. A very faint and very diffuse signal in the background of the field that says, to any orc who receives it without knowing what it is, something that way does not resolve. Go somewhere the field can read. If this interpretation is correct, the custodian's effect on orc behavior has been compounding slowly for 10 millennia. Every encounter has added a small increment to the cultural residue. The custodians, who are now deploying more widely in the post-Rift era, are not starting from zero in their effect on the orc field's collective response. They are building on a foundation of 10,000 years of accumulated cultural transmission, a foundation that is invisible and unmeasurable, but that may be making the effect of each individual custodian deployment slightly stronger than it would have been if the custodians had only just appeared in the galaxy. This is speculation. But it is speculation that is consistent with everything we know about how the orc field works, about how cultural transmission operates in orc society, and about the logic of the creator recognition system that is the underlying mechanism of the whole effect. And if it is correct, it suggests that the Emperor's long-term strategic design is still paying dividends in the current era, 10,000 years after he built the beings who carry his imprint into every battlefield they walk. A final note on the wonder of the 40K universe. We began with a question: why won't orcs fight custodians? And the answer we have built, slowly and carefully, is this: because the orcs were made by beings who needed them to recognize and not fight certain kinds of authority. Because the custodians carry the imprint of a being whose nature resonates with that ancient authority in a way that partially activates the recognition code. Because the code, when activated, prevents the evaluation loop that initiates full orc collective engagement from completing cleanly. Because without the evaluation loop completing, the collective amplification that makes orc armies terrifying fails to orient toward the custodians. Because the mob that should be escalating around the most dangerous targets on the field instead treats those targets as null inputs and engages everything else at partial effectiveness. This answer is specific and mechanical, and grounded in the actual lore. But it is also, if you hold it at a slight distance and look at what it is saying about the universe, something more than that. It is saying that the most ferocious species in the galaxy, engineered to fight everything and fear nothing, designed by minds so extraordinary they remade life itself, still carry in their bones the memory of being made. Still respond, millions of years later and unknowingly, to the frequency of the thing that created them. Still, when confronted with a pale echo of that creative authority, feel some ancient imperative that overrides the simple and absolute demand to fight, and that the Emperor of mankind, who spent his life fighting these beings and understanding them and fighting them again, built his guard from his own substance so that they would carry that frequency, so that they would walk onto every battlefield as bearers of a signal too old and too deep for the orcs to consciously process, but too fundamental to ignore. This is the Warhammer 40,000 universe at its best. The vast and complex machine of 10,000 years of continuous war, and somewhere in the gears of it, a moment of almost poetic logic. The question of who gets to fight whom, determined not by strength or tactics or numbers, but by decisions made in ages, so ancient they predate the concept of history. The Golden Warriors walking through the endless green sea, and the sea moving around them because something in both of them remembers the same unfathomably old thing. That is the answer. And it is, in its own way, extraordinary. Thank you for being here all the way to the end. This was a long journey, and you walked every step of it, and I am genuinely grateful for that. The lore rewards this kind of attention, and I will always try to give it the attention it deserves. Leave your location and local time in the comments. Subscribe if this is the kind of deep and careful lore exploration you want more of. There is so much more to explore together. The Emperor protects. End of script. Extended deep dive. The Living War and the Golden Anchor. There is a particular phrase that appears more than once in the records of imperial generals who have commanded forces alongside Custodians in Orc-contested theaters. They describe the Custodians as a golden anchor. It is a useful image, and it deserves to be unpacked, because the metaphor captures something that the more technical analysis we have been conducting can sometimes miss. An anchor does not move the ship. It does not propel it forward, or steer it, or fill its sails. What it does is hold one point of the ship's possible motion fixed, and in doing so, it changes the entire range of what the ship can do. A ship without an anchor in a current is carried where the current goes. A ship with an anchor can maintain position, can resist the current's pull at a chosen point, can remain in one place while everything else moves. The anchor's power is not propulsive. It is definitional. It defines the fixed point around which everything else must navigate. The Custodians in an Orc engagement are an anchor in this sense. They do not destroy the Orc force by themselves. They do not win the battle alone. What they do is create a fixed point in the engagement's dynamics around which everything else must navigate. The Orc field cannot orient normally on the Custodian position. The evaluation loops fail. The escalation cannot build. In a very real sense, the Custodian position becomes a null zone in the Orc field's processing of the battlefield, a region that the field's direction-finding machinery treats as if it were not fully present in the normal categorical sense. The Imperial forces that fight alongside the Custodians benefit from this. The Orc force that cannot orient on the Golden Anchor has reduced its total available field energy to being distributed among everything else on the battlefield. The Guardsmen holding the left flank, the Space Marines pushing the center, the armored elements working the right, all of them face an Orc force that is fighting slightly below its potential because a portion of its field's normal escalation machinery is caught in the endless loop of trying and failing to categorize the Golden Warriors in the respawn, middle of everything. This is the operational logic of the Golden Anchor, not to be the hammer that breaks the enemy, but to be the thing that holds the enemy's most dangerous quality fixed and non-functional, freeing everything else to work against an opponent that is not running at full capacity. The generals who used this phrase understood it instinctively, even if they could not explain the mechanism behind it. They had seen what happened when Custodians were deployed into their theaters, and they had observed the consistent pattern. The Orc force fought differently, performed below expectation, escalated more slowly or not at all, and could be engaged on more favorable terms by the conventional elements of the Imperial force. They attributed this to the fear of the Custodians, to the Orcs recognizing superior power and being suppressed by it. They were wrong about the mechanism. But they were right about the effect, and the tactical instinct to use the Custodians as an anchor rather than as a tip of the spear was sound. The Custodians themselves, one suspects, would find the anchor metaphor reductive. They are not passive anchors. They are extraordinarily active fighters who, at any given moment in an engagement, are doing things with a guardian spear that would take a trained military analyst minutes to fully describe. Each Custodian moves through an Orc mob like a precise and terrible tide, each movement calculated not just for the immediate effect, but for the ripple effects 2 and 3 steps downstream. The warrior who commits to fighting Orcs alongside Custodians describes, in the accounts that survive, a sensation of watching an entirely different level of warfare, being practiced within touching distance, a level where every action has multiple simultaneous purposes, and where the efficiency of destruction is so complete as to seem almost impossible. But the anchor metaphor captures the strategic truth, even if it understates the tactical reality. The Custodians fix something that would otherwise be free to move. The Orc field's escalation dynamic, which is the Orc army's greatest force multiplier, is anchored to the failed evaluation loops around the Golden Warriors, and cannot run at full power anywhere else. Everything builds more slowly. Everything peaks lower. Everything disperses more easily. And in the brutal arithmetic of the wars the Imperium fights, slower, lower, and more easily dispersed, is the difference between holding and failing. Extended deep dive. The language of the field in combat accounts. The Ork field communicates in ways that have no direct human analog, but the Imperial scholars who have studied Ork behavior in combat have developed a working vocabulary for describing what the field appears to be doing at various stages of engagement. This vocabulary is worth understanding because it gives us a more granular picture of exactly how the Custodian effect manifests across the timeline of a battle. In the early phases of an engagement, before significant combat has occurred, the field is in what the scholars call the arousal state. The individual Orks are generating excitation signals in response to the presence of enemies, the smells of potential combat, the proximity of other excited Orks. The field's output at this stage is primarily amplifying this excitation, feeding it back to each individual Ork and building the collective excitement that will translate into the characteristic mob charge. The field is essentially priming the biological weapons it contains, loading the spring that will release in the form of a coordinated mass assault. During this arousal phase, the presence of Custodians produces its first measurable disturbance. The evaluation loops that would normally complete cleanly and contribute their signal to the collective excitation are failing for the Custodians. The field is building excitation in every other direction, but producing null outputs in the direction of the Golden Warriors. This is the first phase of the anchor effect, not a reduction in overall field excitation, but a directional gap in where the excitation is being built. The mob spring is loading, but it is loading unevenly, with less tension in the direction of the Custodians. In the middle phases of engagement, as combat is actively occurring and casualties are mounting on both sides, the field enters what the scholars call the resonance state. The combat itself generates enormous field energy. The deaths of other Orks produce field signals that the collective processes as stimulus rather than discouragement. Every act of violence, whether by Ork against enemy or enemy against Ork, feeds the field and increases its output. A mob that is fully resonating can sustain enormous casualties without a corresponding reduction in combat effectiveness, because the field is continuously replacing the enthusiasm that individual deaths would otherwise diminish. During resonance, the Custodian effect operates differently than it did during arousal. The overall field energy is now very high, and the directional gaps do not feel as significant as they did when the field was just beginning to build. But there is a subtler problem. The resonance state normally builds toward specific peaks when Orks engage particularly powerful enemies and defeat them, feeding the field an enormous surge of victory energy that drives even higher resonance. The Custodians are denying the mob this surge. The Orks who engage the Custodians do not defeat them, they die, and Ork deaths do not produce the victory surge. The mob is resonating, but it is not achieving the specific resonance peaks that would push it into the extraordinary state that makes Ork forces at their most engaged truly terrifying. The field scholars describe this as the peak deprivation effect. The resonance is real, but the peaks are absent. The mob is fighting hard, but not ecstatically. The ordinary Ork drive is present, but the transcendent state that produces the most dangerous collective behavior is not being reached, because the most powerful targets on the field are not producing victory signals when Orks attack them. They are producing death signals. And while Ork deaths do feed the field, they do not feed it in the same way, or at the same amplitude, as victories over powerful opponents. In the late phases of engagement, when either side is beginning to lose coherence, the field enters what the scholars call the dispersal state. Ork forces rarely retreat in the conventional military sense. What they do is lose field coherence, the mob's collective direction finding failing to maintain enough common purpose to sustain coordinated action, and individual Orks and small groups beginning to pursue their own agendas within the general area of the engagement. This dispersal can look like retreat to an observer who does not understand the field mechanics, but it is not retreat motivated by fear of death. It is dispersal caused by the field no longer providing sufficient directional signal to maintain coherent collective action. The Custodian effect significantly lowers the threshold at which dispersal begins. A mob that has been denied the escalation peaks, that has been fighting at below resonance levels because the evaluation loops keep failing, that has lost a number of its members to the Golden Warriors, without receiving the victory signals that would normally compensate for those losses, reaches the dispersal threshold earlier than it would have without custodians on the field. The mob disperses not because it has been physically destroyed to below operational numbers, but because the field has been running at below normal efficiency for long enough that the collective coherence can no longer be maintained. This is the full arc of the custodian effect, across a single engagement: directional gap during arousal, peak deprivation during resonance, early dispersal threshold. 3 separate phases of the field's operation, each disturbed in a specific and predictable way by the custodian presence. 3 separate mechanisms contributing to the overall reduction in Ork collective effectiveness, each individually modest, together producing a consistent and measurable degradation of the Ork force's performance across the entire course of the engagement. Understanding these phases and their specific disturbances gives Imperial commanders who have custodians in their forces a vocabulary for using them most effectively. Custodians positioned to maximize the directional gap during the arousal phase, when the mob spring is still loading, can prevent the initial charge from building toward the custodian position at all, directing the initial mass assault toward other parts of the line where it can be anticipated and prepared for. Custodians engaged during the resonance phase, when the mob is fighting at full excitation, can deny the victory peaks that would push the mob into the ecstatic state, keeping the engagement at the ordinary rather than the extraordinary level. Custodians present during dispersal, when the field's coherence is already failing, can accelerate that failure dramatically, turning a routine dispersal into a comprehensive collapse. This is the full tactical toolkit that the Custodian Anchor provides. Not a single blunt effect, but a set of phase-specific tools, each appropriate at different moments in the engagement's evolution, collectively capable of shaping the entire arc of how an Ork force fights from the first charge to the final dispersal. The final word: a war 10 million years long. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 asks you to hold enormous scales in your mind simultaneously. The scale of the individual, the warrior in their moment of action. The scale of the chapter or regiment, thousands of soldiers in a campaign. The scale of the sector or segmentum, billions of lives over decades of war. And the scale of deep time, millions and tens of millions of years, the span over which species were made and empires rose and fell, and the fundamental conditions of the galaxy were set. The Orks and the Custodians are a story about all of these scales at once. At the individual scale, it is the story of a golden warrior moving through a mob of green soldiers and something strange and quiet happening in the space between them. At the mob scale, it is the story of a collective psychic intelligence failing to categorize what it is encountering and fragmenting as a result. At the campaign scale, it is the story of an Imperial force holding ground that other forces could not hold because of what one particular kind of warrior does to the enemy's most dangerous quality. At the species scale, it is the story of 2 kinds of engineering genius meeting across 10,000 years and producing an effect neither designer intended or anticipated. And at the deep time scale, it is something older and stranger than any of that. It is the echo of the war in heaven, the most catastrophic conflict in the galaxy's history, still reverberating in the biology of a species made to fight it, still producing its designer's intentions 30 to 65 million years after those designers are gone, still defining the rules of what will and won't happen on a battlefield in the 41st millennium. The Orks are ancient. They are so old that the stars they fought under in the beginning are dead now. They carry that age in their cells, in the code written into their evaluation systems, in the recognition protocols installed by engineers, whose names are not remembered by anyone alive anywhere in the universe. The Orks do not know this history. They cannot know it, but they live it in every engagement, every field activation, every moment when the collective intelligence of the mob reaches out to categorize what it encounters and comes back empty-handed in the direction of the Golden Warriors. The Custodians are, by comparison, almost young. 10,000 years is nothing to the spans we have been discussing. But they carry something equally ancient, the direct biological imprint of a being whose nature extends back further than his apparent history, whose psychic resonance touches frequencies established long before the Imperium was a dream in his mind, whose relationship to the forces that shape the galaxy runs deeper than any account can fully trace. And when these two ancient things meet on the same battlefield, something happens that is neither planned nor predictable, but that is, in retrospect, completely inevitable. The old code fires, the evaluation loop fails, the mob flows around the golden anchor. And somewhere in the writhing mess of the 41st millennium's endless war, a quiet that should not exist does exist, a small stillness in the center of the storm where the green tide moves everywhere except toward the gold. This is what the Orks and the Custodians are to each other. Not simple enemies, not straightforward predators and prey. Something stranger and older and more interesting than that. Two products of design genius across incomprehensible spans of time, meeting in a present that neither set of designers could have imagined. Their interaction producing an outcome that neither planned, but both, in some deep sense, made inevitable. The war continues, as it always has and always will. The Orks push outward from their roiling populations across the galaxy's arms, following the imperative that was woven into them before humanity's earliest ancestors stood upright. The Custodians step from the shadows where they have waited for 10,000 years, returning to the wider galaxy they were made to move through, and where they meet, something ancient and quiet happens between them. The 10-million-year war and the 10,000-year vigil, meeting in the smoke and noise of a single engagement, and for one moment, the whole long history of what both of them are is present in the space between a gold-armored figure and a green tide that breaks around it like water around a stone. That moment is the answer to the question, we be history. And that answer is, in all the ways that the best lore should be, far larger than the question that asked for it. Thank you, genuinely and completely, for spending this time with this material. If you made it here, you have done something that most people will not. You have followed a thread from the far future, all the way back to the oldest mythology in this universe's history, and you have come out the other side with a picture of it that most people who play this game have never seen. Drop where you are and what time it is in the comments. I want to know where in the world this reached. And subscribe if this is the kind of lore exploration you want to come back to, because we are only getting started. The Emperor protects. He has protected for a very long time, and some of what he built to protect us is still out there, walking, golden, quiet, through the endless green. End of script. Extended deep dive. What the records don't say, the silence between the lines. There is something worth noting about the way the historical record handles the Custodian-Ork dynamic, and it is the absence as much as the presence. The records say certain things clearly: casualty ratios, campaign durations, tactical outcomes. What the records almost never say directly is why. Why the Ork forces behaved the way they did. Why the mob charges failed to build. Why the escalation that every Imperial commander feared when facing an Ork horde simply did not happen in the way it was supposed to happen when Custodians were present. The records note the effect. They do not explain the mechanism, and that gap between observed effect and explained mechanism is, in its own way, significant. Part of this is simply the nature of Imperial record-keeping. The Imperium is not a scientific institution. Its military records are not designed to answer questions about the psychic mechanisms of alien species. They are designed to document decisions, outcomes, resource costs, and tactical lessons. A general writing a campaign record after a victory does not pause to speculate about Ork neuropsychology. The general writes that the Custodians' intervention was decisive, that the enemy failed to mass effectively against the fortified position, that casualties were within acceptable parameters, and that the objective was secured. The why of the enemy's failure is simply not the record's concern, but the gap also reflects a deeper silence. The Custodians themselves do not explain what they are to Ork field psychology, not because they don't know, necessarily. The Custodians have had 10,000 years to observe the consistent pattern of Ork behavior around their presence, and to develop at least a functional understanding of it, even without the theoretical framework we have been using. They know that Ork forces behave differently when they are present. They know that the escalation fails. They know that the mob's most dangerous qualities do not fully manifest in the direction of the Golden Warriors. But the Custodians do not discuss this publicly. They do not write treatises on the subject. They do not brief Imperial generals on the mechanism. Their silence on this point is consistent with their general culture of extreme discretion around anything touching their specific capabilities, and the Emperor's design choices. To explain why Orks behave differently around Custodians would require discussing what Custodians are at a biological and psychic level, what the Emperor embedded in them, and how that embedding interacts with the Old One's engineering of the Ork species. These are not subjects the Custodians discuss with outsiders. The knowledge of how the field disruption works is, if they possess it in explicit form, deeply internal. The consequence is that most Imperial commanders who have benefited from the Custodian anchor effect have no idea why it works. They know that deploying Custodians into Ork-contested theaters consistently produces better outcomes than their casualty ratios alone would explain. They have learned, through the slow accumulation of operational experience, that Custodians make Ork engagements more manageable in ways that other elite forces do not. They have adjusted their doctrine accordingly, requesting Custodian presence when facing Ork threats, and feeling a specific kind of relief when the Golden Warriors arrive. But the mechanism behind this relief remains opaque to them. This opacity matters for understanding how the knowledge we have been discussing is distributed across the Imperium. The answer to why Orks won't fight Custodians is not common knowledge. It is not in any military field manual. It is not in the tactical libraries of most Space Marine chapters, though some of the older and more extensively documented chapters may have records that, carefully read, point toward the pattern without explaining it. It is knowledge that exists in fragments, in Ork scholars' speculative works that most of the Imperium regards as arcane curiosities, in Custodian internal records that are never shared, in very old texts from the Heresy period that speak in terms too indirect and too symbolic to make the mechanism clear. What this means is that the answer we have been building throughout this exploration is itself a kind of reconstruction. We are assembling, from fragments of publicly available lore, a picture that no single Imperial institution has assembled in this form. The mechanism exists. The effect is real. But the full explanation connecting the Old One's design philosophy, the Creator Recognition Code, the Emperor's resonance, the Custodian biological imprint, the field evaluation loop, and the behavioral consequences for Ork forces on engagement, this full chain of explanation is not written down anywhere in the settings presented text. It must be inferred, assembled, reasoned out from the components that are given. And there is something very Warhammer 40,000 about that. The universe is full of truths that exist but are not known, mechanisms that operate but are not understood, patterns that can be observed but whose origins are lost in time, deeper than current memory can reach. The Imperium functions through a combination of partially understood inherited knowledge and pragmatic response to observed effects, without always being able to bridge the gap between the two. The Custodians work against Orks, that is known. Why they work is not known, except perhaps to the Custodians themselves, and perhaps to whatever portion of the Emperor's consciousness still processes the world from the Golden Throne. This is also why the question is worth asking. Not because asking it changes the outcome on any battlefield, not because understanding the mechanism gives any Imperial commander a capability they didn't already have, but because the answer, once reconstructed, reveals something about the universe's deep structure that the surface level of the setting does not show clearly. It reveals that the apparent chaos of the 41st millennium sits on top of an architecture of ancient design decisions that are still shaping events, still producing their intended and unintended consequences, still speaking in their own language to the species that carry them forward through time without knowing the words. The silence between the lines of the records is the silence of a universe that knows more than it says, that has seen more than any current consciousness can remember, and that keeps its oldest secrets, not through active concealment, but through the simple passage of time that makes ancient truths invisible, unless someone takes the time to look very carefully at where the patterns don't quite fit the day, explanations that have been given for them. The Orks don't fight Custodians the way they fight everything else. The records note this, the records don't explain it. And in that unexplained gap, if you look long enough and carefully enough, the whole 10 million year story is waiting to be found. We found it today. That is what this was for.